The town of Red Creek had a way of making people feel small before they even stepped off the stage. Silas Crow felt no such smallness. He stood at the edge of Beckett Callahan's fence line, close enough to be seen, far enough to claim he was just passing through, and he smiled at the two ranch hands struggling to pull a calf from the mud near the dry creek bed. The calf was already too thin. The creek was already too low. Crow had made sure of both. He'd had his men divert the upper tributary 3 weeks ago. A small thing, the kind of thing that looked like drought and nothing else. He watched the calf go still in the mud, watched one of the hands swear and look at the sky like the sky owed him something, and Crow tipped his hat to no one and walked back to his horse. He didn't need to stay to see what came next. He already knew. Beckett Callahan was about to lose everything, and Silas Crow was already deciding which barn he'd turn into a second stable. If you've ever been somewhere that nobody wanted you, if you've ever walked into a room and felt the air change, then you already know something about what Marlowe Hayes was carrying the morning she rode into Red Creek. She wasn't carrying much else. One trunk, one name nobody out here recognized, and a letter she'd already read so many times the fold lines had turned soft as skin. Stay with this story. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, do it now, because what Marlowe does in the days that follow is the kind of thing that doesn't announce itself. It builds, and you don't want to miss a single part of it. Hit the like button, leave a comment with your city or country. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The letter had been written by a man Marlowe had never met, addressed to her father, and it said almost nothing of consequence. It mentioned the acreage. It mentioned the arrangement. It said the man's name was Beckett Callahan, that he was established in the territory, that he required a wife of reasonable temperament and practical disposition. It did not say what he looked like. It did not say why a man of that standing needed to reach as far as Hester County to find a wife, nor why no woman closer had agreed to become one. Her father had read it to her at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening in March, and by Saturday morning she'd already understood that the reading had been a formality. The decision was already made. She was 30 years old, which in Hester County meant she had passed some invisible threshold, after which a woman became a problem to be solved rather than a person to be considered. She was broad across the shoulders, plain-faced, in the way that didn't photograph well, and she'd never learned to make her silences feel comfortable to other people. She had, in the years since her mother died, kept her father's accounts, negotiated with suppliers, and twice corrected a bank error that would have cost the family more money than they could afford to lose. Nobody had thought to mention any of that in the letter. She hadn't cried about it. That wasn't the kind of woman she was. She'd sat with the information for 2 days, run the numbers in her head, because Marlowe Hayes always ran the numbers, and she'd decided that if this was what was in front of her, she would walk toward it with her eyes open, rather than stumble into it looking the other way. She just hadn't anticipated Red Creek being quite this much. The stage rolled in on a Wednesday, late afternoon, and the town's main street was wide and unpaved and smelled of horse and old wood and something else she couldn't name, something dusty and a little sour, like a building that had been closed up too long. There were people on the boardwalk who stopped to look at the stage, which was normal, and then kept looking, which told her something. Word had gotten ahead of her. That happened. She gathered her skirt and stepped down onto the packed dirt without assistance, because the driver was already unhitching and not paying attention, and she stood in the street holding her traveling bag and let people look. A woman with red hair pinned up too tightly leaned toward another woman and said something behind her hand. Marlowe heard the word arrangement and then a sound that was almost a laugh but landed softer, more pitying than mean. She'd take pity over contempt any day. Pity she could work around. A young man from the livery came to collect her trunk without being asked, which was either courtesy or efficiency, and he pointed her toward a building across the street, where a man was already waiting in the doorway. Not Callahan. This man was smaller, older, with a clerk's posture and a clerk's expression neutral. Practiced, useful. Miss Hayes, he said it without inflection. I'm Aldous Finch, Mr. Callahan's man of business. He sends his apologies. He was delayed at the property and couldn't make the ride in. She took note of that. A man who sends a clerk to collect his future wife either doesn't know how that reads or doesn't care. She was not yet sure which applied to Beckett Callahan. I appreciate the reception, she said, which was only half true, but not the half that mattered. Finch led her to a room above the dry goods store, which turned out to be clean and had a window that faced east, which she preferred. He told her the magistrate would perform the ceremony the following morning, that Mr. Callahan would be in attendance, that she was welcome to take supper downstairs. He said all of this in the same flat, efficient register, and she decided she neither liked nor disliked him. He was simply a man doing what he'd been told. She ate supper alone, which was fine. She was used to eating alone. Beckett Callahan arrived early. She was standing at the window of her room, watching the street settle into morning quiet, when she saw him come in from the south end of town on a dark horse with no particular markings. He rode the way men ride when riding is just a way to get somewhere, not a performance straight back, easy in the saddle, horse moving at a pace that was steady and not hurried. He was taller than she'd expected, though she hadn't been told to expect anything specific. Dark hair going a little gray at the temple, a jaw that looked like it hadn't quite decided whether to be handsome or just hard. He didn't look at the street when he rode through it. He looked straight ahead. She stepped back from the window. Not because she didn't want to see him, she did, but because she didn't want to be caught looking, which was a distinction that mattered to her in a way she couldn't fully explain. The ceremony was at 10 o'clock in a small room behind the magistrate's office. Present were Callahan, Marlowe, Finch's witness, and a woman from the land office whose name Marlowe didn't catch. The magistrate was a compact man with a beard going yellow at the edges and a voice that was too large for the room. He read from his book. Callahan said the necessary words in the flat, direct way of a man finishing a piece of work. Marlowe said hers clearly and looked at the wall behind the magistrate's left shoulder, which was where she'd decided to look, because looking at Callahan felt like too much, and looking at the floor felt like an admission of something she hadn't agreed to admit. There was no ring. Finch had mentioned a ring would be arranged later, which Marlowe understood to mean it had been forgotten, which told her something about how this marriage had been organized. Nobody congratulated them. Finch shook Callahan's hand, and that was the extent of ceremony. Outside, Callahan looked at her for the first time directly. He was not unkind. He was also not warm. He said, "The ride out takes about 2 hours. Your trunk will follow with Finch tomorrow." "That's fine," she said. "You can ride?" "Yes." He nodded, and that was the end of the conversation, and they rode out of Red Creek side by side without speaking, and Marlowe counted fence posts in her head to give her mind something to do, because it was that, or think too hard about what she'd just agreed to. The Callahan property was larger than the letter had made it sound, which was saying something, since the letter had been specific about acreage in the proud, careful way of a man who'd put years into every acre. The main house was stone and timber, 2 stories, with a porch that ran the full width of the front, and a separate cookhouse close enough to be convenient, and far enough to keep the smell out of the main rooms. There were barns, corrals, bunkhouses, outbuildings she couldn't yet name the purpose of, cattle dotting the hills in the middle distance, ranch hands moving around the yard, stopping when they saw the horses come in, doing the thing where they pretend to be busy while they're actually just getting a look. She noticed 2 things immediately. The first was that the creek to the east of the house was running lower than it should have been this time of year, even in dry weather. The water line on the bank stones told her where the normal level sat, and what she was looking at was well short of that. The second was the way the ranch hands looked at her. It wasn't hostility, not exactly. It was the kind of look that comes before hostility assessment, conclusion, decision, and the conclusion was being reached fast. She recognized the arithmetic. A strange woman, arrived by arrangement, broad and quiet and not from here. Add those together and you got a liability. The hands weren't going to like her. They'd decided that before her horse stopped moving, a man named Decker, who turned out to be the foreman, came forward to take their horses, and he was civil enough to Callahan and acknowledged Marlowe with a nod so brief it barely qualified. She'd seen foremen do this before, with her father's business partners, give just enough acknowledgement to avoid being called rude, then proceed as if the person wasn't there. Beckett showed her the house, which was thorough but brief. Kitchen, sitting room, upstairs rooms. He'd cleared space in the second bedroom, which told her the arrangement had a specific structure in mind, one that suited her fine and that she did not comment on. He showed her where the household accounts were kept, which surprised her. She hadn't expected to be shown that on the first day, and he told her she was welcome to review them if she had interest in that sort of thing. "I have some interest in that sort of thing," she said. He looked at her for a second in the way you look at a statement you weren't quite expecting. And then he nodded and said supper was at 6 and left to deal with whatever a man who runs 5,000 acres has to deal with by late afternoon. She went back to the window and looked at that creek. The accounts were a disaster, not dramatically so. Not in the way that announces itself in red numbers and angry letters from banks. This was a quieter kind of disaster, the kind that hides in routine and repetition, the kind you only see if you've been trained to notice what's being spent where and whether the return justifies it. Marlowe spent 3 evenings going through the ledgers Beckett had given her access to, and what she found was a ranch that had been run on instinct and habit for a long time, with income that had been adequate when the land was producing at full capacity, but was now straining against costs that hadn't been adjusted in years. The cattle count was down from where it should have been. She could see that in the purchase records compared against the sales figures. Either animals were being lost to disease or predators at a higher rate than normal, or she wrote that thought down and kept it. The water expenses were unusual too. Not the main creek that was fed from the upper watershed and had always been adequate. But there were payments going out to a secondary supply that Marlowe couldn't locate in any of the property descriptions. She asked Finch about it when he arrived with her trunk on Thursday, and he said he'd look into it, in the tone of a man who had been asked to look into things before and had not always done so with urgency. She did not push him. She was still new enough that pushing felt risky in a specific way, not for her safety but for the delicate early-stage thing that was her position on this ranch. She needed to be careful about how quickly she pressed. If she came in too fast and too hard and turned out to be wrong about something, she'd lose any credibility she might otherwise build. And credibility, she already understood, was going to be her only real currency out here. She was patient. She had always been patient. It was the thing about her that people tended to mistake for passivity until she was ready to move. The first real confrontation came on a Saturday 8 days after she arrived. It was in the kitchen, which was technically her domain in the domestic sense, that a ranch wife's domain was the domestic sphere, but which in practical terms had been run for the past 3 years by a cook named Beulah, who had very fixed ideas about her kitchen, and who had made no secret of the fact that she considered Marlowe's presence in it an imposition. Beulah was not cruel. She was territorial, which is a different thing, and on a frontier ranch territoriality is almost always earned rather than arbitrary, so Marlowe didn't take it personally. What she did take note of was the conversation she overheard between Beulah and one of the younger hands, a lanky boy named Cole, who came to the kitchen door to collect his midday meal, and lingered there talking while Marlowe was working at the far end of the room. She went through the books, Cole said, not bothering to lower his voice. What business does she have in the books? Beulah said. Callahan let her. Beulah made a sound like she was considering how she felt about that, and apparently she had feelings. Man's guy has no sense about some things, she said. Stranger rides in, sits herself down in his house, starts poking through his money. Don't know why a man would let that happen. Decker says she's going to be trouble, Cole offered. Decker's usually right about people. Marlowe continued working and didn't turn around. Her face was doing something complicated that she controlled carefully, because you can't let a kitchen know your face. She wasn't angry, exactly. What she felt was more like the particular weariness of recognizing a pattern you'd hoped not to find. These people had decided who she was before they had a single piece of real evidence to support the conclusion. They'd decided she was an interloper, a liability, a foreign element in a working system that didn't need her and hadn't asked for her, which, to be fair, was partially true. The ranch hadn't asked for her, but then again, she hadn't asked for the ranch. She waited until Cole left, and then she said, without turning around, Beulah, do you know anything about the water situation on the east side of the property? Beulah was quiet for a moment. What about it? The creek's running low. I was curious if that's been happening all season or just recently. Another pause. Longer creek does what creeks do, Beulah finally said. It's been dry, right, Marlowe said. I'll ask Beckett. She didn't say it as a threat. She said it as a simple statement of intent, and she felt Beulah go still behind her, recalibrating something, though Marlowe didn't know what. She put the lid on the pot she was tending and went to find the ledger she'd left in the sitting room. Beckett was different than she'd been afraid he would be. She'd gone into this expecting a specific type, the frontier wealthy kind of man who wore his authority like a coat he never took off, who moved through the world assuming compliance and occasionally getting angry when it didn't materialize. She'd known men like that. They were not entirely without charm, but they were exhausting, and their particular brand of charm was designed to make you feel grateful for being noticed, which was a currency she'd stopped accepting somewhere around age 24. Beckett wasn't that. He was something more complicated and, in its way, harder to manage. A man who had run on his own judgment for so long that he'd stopped automatically accounting for the possibility of being wrong. Not arrogant, just solitary. Self-contained in the way of someone who'd learned that other people's assessments of a situation were more often a distraction than a resource. He ate supper at the table every night, and he was never rude about the food, and he asked practical questions about what she needed, about how she was settling in. But the questions had the quality of a checklist rather than genuine curiosity, and she answered them the same way, which was fine, because the alternative was pretending to a warmth neither of them had yet earned. He came in from the south pasture on a Tuesday evening with dried mud to his knees and a cut on his right hand that he'd wrapped in a piece of cloth and forgotten about, and when she saw it, she said, without deciding to, that should be cleaned out. He looked at his hand like he'd forgotten it was attached to him. It's fine. It's not fine, it's full of pasture dirt, and if it gets infected, you'll lose 2 weeks of work at minimum. She was already moving toward the cabinet where the medical supplies were kept, because she'd located those in her second day, because locating things was how she oriented herself to new spaces. Sit down. He stood there for a moment in the way of a man unused to being told to sit down, and she thought he was going to argue, and then he pulled out a chair and sat down, which surprised her enough that she almost said something. She didn't. She cleaned the cut with the focused efficiency she applied to everything, and she didn't make small talk about it, and he didn't either. And when she was done, he said, "Thank you," in a voice that sounded like he'd had to find the words. "You're welcome," she said. She put the medical supplies back and went to check on supper. It was not a turning point. She was too careful a thinker to call any single moment a turning point. But something shifted slightly in the way he looked at her after that, some minor recalibration that she noted and filed. The cattle started disappearing on the 18th day. Not dramatically. Not a whole herd gone overnight. 5 head one morning, 3 the next. Decker reported it to Beckett with the contained urgency of a man who's seen things go wrong before and has learned to save the alarm for when it's absolutely necessary. Beckett listened, asked questions, rode out to look at the grazing area where the animals had been, and came back with the kind of carefully controlled expression that meant something had gotten to him. Marlowe heard about it from Beulah, who'd heard it from Cole, who'd been in the barn when Decker reported in. She went out to look at the creek that afternoon, not the east side this time, the main water supply, the one that ran through the center of the property. She walked along the bank farther than she usually went, past the point where the property maps she'd studied showed the water rights claim ending, past a cluster of cottonwoods that were thick enough to screen her from anyone working in the near fields. She found the tracks half a mile in. They were 3 days old, maybe 4 hard to tell, given the dryness, but they were there. And they were not cattle tracks, and they were not ranch hand tracks. The boot pattern was distinctive, wider at the heel than the heel she'd seen on any of the Callahan hands' boots, and there were at least 4 sets of them, moving east. She crouched there in the dryness and the heat, and she thought about what she was looking at, and what it meant, and what she was going to do with what it meant. Then she walked back to the house and asked Beckett if she could speak with him about the water. She told him all of it. The creek levels from the first day, the secondary water payment she couldn't place in the accounts, the tracks along the upper bank. She laid it out in order, without editorializing, because she'd learned that certain men heard evidence better when it was presented as a sequence, rather than a conclusion. She was watching his face the whole time. He listened. She gave him credit for that. He actually listened, which was more than she'd been certain he was capable of. His expression moved through several positions: skepticism, reluctant interest, something that looked like concentration. When she finished, he said, "You think someone's diverting water above our claim?" "I think the evidence is consistent with it," she said. "I don't know who." He was quiet. He picked up the account ledger she'd left open to the page with the unexplained payment, and he looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "Decker said you'd been going through the books. You gave me access to them." "I know I did." He put the ledger down. He stopped. "You didn't expect me to read them carefully," she said. He looked at her. "No, I didn't. It wasn't an apology. It was just honesty, which she respected more." "The tracks could be nothing," she said. "Riders passing through, hunters. There are a dozen explanations that don't point to what I'm suggesting. I want to be careful about that. But you don't think it's nothing?" "No," she said. "I don't." He stood up and walked to the window. The one she'd learned was where he went when he was thinking, and she waited, because she'd learned that too. "I'll ride out in the morning," he said finally. "Have a look. I'd like to come." He turned from the window. She kept her face neutral, because she knew how the request sounded, and she knew what he was deciding, and she did not think it would help her cause to look like she was holding her breath. "All right," he said. They found more than tracks. A quarter-mile past what Marlowe had seen the day before, where the creek bent north through a narrow gap in the hills, someone had built a rough diversion, not sophisticated, not permanent, but effective. A berm of packed earth and stone that pushed a significant portion of the flow off to the east towards Silas Crow's property. The work was weeks old, maybe longer. Beckett dismounted and stood at the edge of it for a full minute without speaking. Marlowe didn't speak either. She looked at the berm and at the diverted channel, which was clearly visible in the dry earth, a darker stripe of ground where water had been flowing, where it had no business flowing. And she thought about the cattle disappearances, and the strange tracks, and the payment in the ledger that led nowhere, and she thought, this is not a drought. This is something being done to a man who doesn't yet know it's being done to him. Beckett finally said Crow. It was the first time she'd heard the name. "You know who did this? I know who benefits from it." He walked along the berm, looking at it carefully, and she followed at a distance because she could tell he was working something out, and he needed space to do it. Silas Crow owns the property to the east. He's been trying to buy this land for 6 years. I wouldn't sell. And if you can't sustain the operation, he doesn't need to buy it. He just needs to wait. He turned to look at her. There was something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Not anger exactly, but the thing that lives just below anger, the thing that's colder and more considered. How did you notice the water level? I noticed things, she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked back at the berm, and she had the feeling of watching something happen inside a person that you can't quite name, but that you recognize as significant. We need to document this, she said. Photographs, if we can get someone with a camera out here. Measurements. Dates. All of it in writing before we move anything or do anything that could muddy the evidence. Decker will want to tear it down today. I know. That's why I'm saying it now. He said, you know what you're talking about with this kind of thing? Legal documentation? My father had a property dispute when I was 17, she said. He lost it because he moved too fast and destroyed the physical evidence before anyone could verify it. We lived with the consequences for a long time. She looked at the berm. I learned from that. Beckett Callahan was quiet. Then he said, all right, we do it your way. They rode back to the ranch in the same silence they'd ridden out in. But it was a different silence, now less empty. More like two people in the same room, choosing not to speak rather than having nothing to say. Decker did not take the news well. Crow's been pulling this kind of thing for years, he said, and his voice had the tight, controlled quality of a man who was choosing his words carefully in front of a woman he did not trust but could not ignore. We should ride over there, make clear. We're not going anywhere until we have the documentation in hand, Beckett said. Decker's jaw shifted. His eyes moved to Marlowe for just a moment, a fraction of a second, and she saw in that look the specific kind of resentment that forms when a man believes an outcome has been produced by outside influence, meaning her, and that the outcome is wrong. He wasn't wrong that she'd influenced it. He was wrong about the outcome being wrong. Those were different things. Callahan. I said we wait, Beckett said. Not loud, not hard, just final in the way of someone who means it. Decker left. Cole, who'd been standing near the barn door, left with him. Marlowe heard their boots on the packed dirt going toward the bunkhouse. Decker thinks you're making a mistake, she said. Decker thinks I'm doing what you told me to do, Beckett said. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching the hands walk away. Which isn't the same thing, is it not? He finally looked at her. You laid out the reasoning. The reasoning sound. That's why I agreed. He paused. That's the only reason I agreed. She nodded. Good. She went inside to write up what they'd seen that morning while the details were still clean in her mind. She found the second set of tracks 2 days later. These were on the south side of the property, near the lower pasture where the missing cattle had last been seen. Whoever had moved through here had known which way the camera blind spots would be. There was no direct sightline from the ranch buildings to this part of the fence, which meant they'd scouted. This wasn't opportunistic rustling. This was a coordinated removal of animals from a specific location at a time when they were least likely to be discovered. She stood at the fence and counted the broken posts. 4 of them, recently replaced with temporary stakes that would hold until someone wanted to move animals through again, then pulled and the gap opened. She thought, they're planning to come back. She didn't tell Beckett immediately. She thought about it for 3 hours first, running the scenario out in all its directions, because the moment she told him, the pressure to act would increase and she needed to be certain she was ready to argue for patience a second time. Because this was the kind of thing that made men want to ride, and she understood that impulse she felt something like it herself. But she also knew that what Crow wanted, maybe, was exactly that. For Beckett to act without proof. To give him something to answer for legally before Beckett had anything solid to use in return. She told him at supper. He listened again, with the same focused stillness he'd brought to the first conversation, and when she was done, he said, How sure are you? Not completely, but enough. If we stake that pasture tonight and they come through, we'd catch them, not just suspect them, she said, and we'd have witnesses. He thought about that. Decker, he said, and it wasn't a question. He should be there. And 2 other hands whose word is reliable. Cole's unreliable, he said. Talk too much, agreed. It was the most naturally they'd spoken yet, and she registered that but didn't let herself settle into it. Because she'd learned years before she ever heard of Red Creek that the distance between reasonable working trust and something more complicated was a distance worth being careful about. They staked the south pasture that night, Beckett, Decker, and 2 hands named Garrett and Pruitt positioned at points around the lower fence. Marlowe was back at the house. She'd suggested her own position. Beckett had said no. She'd known he would say no, and she hadn't pushed it because there were fights worth having, and fights that cost more than they return. She sat at the kitchen table instead, with the ledger and a lamp, and she went through the accounts again, looking for the thread she'd been following, the payment line she couldn't source. And at nearly 11 o'clock, when the house was dark except for her lamp, she found it. The payment was to a man named Voss, listed as a supply contractor, a familiar accounting category, the kind of thing that doesn't prompt a second look unless you're already suspicious. But Voss wasn't in any of the supplier records. He wasn't in the correspondence files. He was nowhere except this single repeating line item going back 14 months. Regular payments, always the same amount, always on the same day of the month. She sat with it for a long time. Then she wrote the name down and put it at the top of the page. Outside, somewhere in the dark south pasture, there were men crouched in the dark waiting for other men who may or may not be coming. And here in the kitchen, in the lamplight, she'd found a name she hadn't been looking for. And she was already thinking about what it meant, and who it connected to, and what she was going to do with it. The kettle went cold without her noticing. She kept writing. They caught 3 men at the south pasture fence at midnight. Marlowe heard about it in the morning from the sound of boots on the porch, before dawn had fully settled, and she was already dressed because she hadn't slept much. She came out to find Beckett at the kitchen table, with dried mud on his coat, and the particular kind of tired that comes from a night of sustained alertness rather than labor. Garrett and Pruitt were visible through the window, moving toward the bunkhouse. Decker was nowhere she could see. 3 of them, Beckett said, before she could ask. Crow's men. I know 2 of them by face. They've worked his property for at least 2 years. Are they secured? Locked in the feed barn. Garrett's is on watch. He looked at his hands, which were resting flat on the table. They had the fence posts pulled already. Would have moved a dozen head through before morning if Garrett hadn't been positioned where he was. She sat down across from him. Did they say anything? Not voluntarily, he glanced up. I didn't push it. Figured that's the kind of thing that needs a different setting. The sheriff, she said, sent Cole to town at first light. Should be back by mid-morning. He was quiet for a moment. You found something last night. I could see it on your face when I came in. She'd been deciding how to tell him since she found it. She got up, retrieved the ledger from the sitting room where she'd left it marked, and put it on the table in front of him, with her finger on the name Voss. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. 14 months, she said. Same amount, same day every month. He's not in any of your supplier files. I went through all of them. Voss, he said quietly, and the way he said it. Not like he was reading a name for the first time, but like he was confirming something he'd been uncertain of. Told her immediately. You know the name, she said. I know a Harlan Voss. He manages Crow's Eastern operations, livestock mostly. He put the ledger down. I never hired anyone by that name. And someone else created this line item, she said. Someone who had access to the accounts and knew the payment schedule well enough to insert a recurring entry without it drawing attention. The silence that followed was different from his usual silences. This one had weight in it, the specific weight of a man working out who had access, who had the knowledge, and what that meant about the people he'd trusted. She waited. She was good at waiting. Finch handles the monthly reconciliation, he said finally. I know. I've had Finch for 9 years. I know that too, she said. I'm not telling you what to conclude. I'm telling you what's in the ledger. He looked at her for a moment that lasted a beat longer than was comfortable, and she held it without dropping her eyes, because this was important, not the looking, but the not looking away. How sure are you the entry's fraudulent? I'm sure it doesn't correspond to any legitimate contract in your records, she said. What it corresponds to beyond that, I can't tell you with certainty. But I can tell you that 14 months of payments to a man who manages Crow's Eastern operations, inserted into your accounts by someone with administrative access, is not a coincidence I know how to explain any other way. He pushed back from the table and stood up. He went to the window. She'd come to think of that window as the place where Beckett Callahan went to have the hard thoughts he couldn't have sitting down. I'll need to talk to Finch, he said. Before the sheriff gets here, she said. Not after. If Finch knows the men in the barn were caught last night, he'll have time to prepare. Beckett was still looking out the window. How do you know he doesn't already know? I don't, she said. But he lives in town. Cole would have had to pass his place on the way to the sheriff's office, and Cole left before dawn. It's possible he doesn't know yet. That window closes fast. He turned from the window. You want to come? The question surprised her. She hadn't asked, hadn't expected to be offered. Yes, then get your coat. Finch lived in a narrow house at the north end of Red Creek's Main Street, the kind of house that said its owner had enough money to be comfortable and not enough ambition to want more. Marlowe had been to his office twice, but she'd never been to his home, and she took note of details as they wrote in the curtains, which were drawn. The horse tied at the post near the side door rather than in the small stable behind the building, which suggested the horse had been brought out recently rather than settled in for the night. Beckett noticed the horse too. She saw it in the slight change in how he held his reins. They knocked. There was a delay that ran a beat too long before the door opened. Finch was dressed, which was not surprising at this hour, but there was something about him that was not quite composed, a quality of arrangement, like a man who'd had 10 seconds to put himself together before answering. "Mr. Callahan," he said. His eyes moved to Marlowe without settling on her. "Mrs. Callahan. This is I wasn't expecting." "I know you weren't," Beckett said. "Can we come in?" Finch stepped back to let them in, and Marlowe moved through the doorway watching him do it, watching the small choreography of his hands and his weight, and the direction his attention went. There was a glass on the table near the fireplace that had recently held something, and a piece of paper on the writing desk that he had turned face down when they came through the door. In a motion so practiced, it was almost invisible. Almost she didn't look at it. She looked at Beckett. He was looking at Finch with the calm, focused expression she'd come to recognize as his working face. The one that wasn't hard or cold, but simply fully present. "I need to ask you about a payment record," Beckett said. "A man named Voss. Harlan Voss. There are 14 months of payments going out of my accounts to that name, and I have no contract for it." Finch's face did something. She was watching carefully enough to see it, a very small movement, a kind of internal adjustment, like a man shifting weight when a floor he thought was solid turns out not to be. "Voss," Finch said carefully. I believe that's a supply arrangement, isn't it? Feed supplements for the East Herd, I think it was." "There's no contract," Beckett said, "and no corresponding supply receipt. Checked before we came," which was not entirely accurate. Marlowe had checked, but she appreciated the plural implication. She said nothing. "I'd need to look at the records," Finch said. "I handle a great deal of 14 months, Aldous," Beckett said. "Same amount, same day." "That's not a mistake, that's a pattern." The silence that followed was not comfortable. Marlowe watched Finch and she thought, he's not deciding whether to lie. He's deciding how much truth he can concede while keeping what matters hidden. Those are different calculations, and they produce different behavior, and what she was watching was the second one. "I may have made an administrative error," Finch said finally. "If the contract documentation is missing." "The men who came through the south fence last night work for Silas Crow," Beckett said. He said it very quietly. "And Harlan Voss manages Crow's eastern operations. And you've been sending Crow's man money from my accounts for over a year." He paused. "I'm not asking you to explain an administrative error, Aldous. I'm asking you to tell me what you were paid to do." Finch sat down. It was not a controlled movement. His knees gave slightly, as though something underneath him had stopped holding. Marlowe thought. There it is, he told them enough. Not everything's. She was under no illusion that they'd gotten everything. Men like Finch, who've been careful for a long time, don't come apart entirely in one conversation. They give you what they calculate is the minimum necessary to seem cooperative, and they hold the rest. But the minimum was not nothing. Crow had approached Finch 2 years ago. Not with a direct offer. Crow was too cautious for that. He'd done it obliquely, the way corruption usually moves, through implication and adjacency, a favor here, a piece of information there, a gradual accumulation of small accommodations until the line had been crossed so many times it stopped being visible. Finch had provided Crow with financial information, cash flow patterns, cattle sale schedules, the dates and amounts of major purchases. Information that would tell a careful man exactly when Beckett Callahan was most vulnerable and least liquid. The water diversion had not been Finch's doing directly. He hadn't known the specifics of it until later. But the payments to Voss were a channel money moving from Beckett's own accounts to fund the operation being run against him. Finch had constructed the entry, inserted it, and maintained it for 14 months. And he'd been paid separately by Crow's people in cash at intervals that left no record. He said all of this in the flat, deflated voice of a man who has stopped performing and started simply talking, and Marlowe wrote it down. She'd brought paper without announcing why, and Finch had noticed but not objected, because documentation was the thing, and she was not going to let this conversation exist only in memory. When the sheriff arrived at the Callahan ranch at mid-morning and found not only 3 men in the feed barn, but a written statement from Finch and a ledger with flagged entries and a set of documented dates and measurements from the water diversion site, it was more than enough to warrant immediate action against Crow's property. It was more, in fact, than the sheriff had expected. He said so, looking at the folder of materials Marlowe handed him, in the slightly surprised way of a man who'd anticipated a much simpler conversation. "Who put this together?" he asked. "We did," Beckett said. He was standing slightly to her left. He didn't look at her when he said it. She didn't correct him. The days that followed were not triumphant. That was the thing nobody told you about being right. Being right didn't feel like winning. It felt like a sustained, exhausting management of consequences. The ranch hands were divided in a way that was worse than outright opposition. Few of them, Garrett and Pruitt among them, seemed to revise their assessment of Marlowe in the way you revise an assessment when evidence demands it, quietly, without ceremony, by simply treating her differently than before. Garrett started saying good morning when he passed her. Pruitt asked her once about the east fence posts and whether she thought the temporary stakes needed replacing, which was the kind of question you ask someone whose judgment you've decided is worth soliciting. She answered him directly, and he listened and went and did what she'd suggested, and that was that. Decker was not among those who revised anything. He was careful about it, careful in the specific way of someone who has decided to wait rather than fight, which she recognized as more dangerous than open hostility, because you can work with open hostility, and you can't work with patience you can't see. He was civil at meals, professional in his reports to Beckett, and entirely unchanged in the quality of his attention when she was in the room, which was the particular inattention of a person who has decided you don't quite exist in any way that matters. She noticed, and she didn't address it. Not yet. There was enough happening. Cattle that had been moved through the south fence were recovered from a holding location on Crow's property that the sheriff located within 48 hours. They came back in worse shape than they'd left. Thin stressed, 2 of them with injuries that suggested rough handling, and seeing them come in through the gate did something to the hands that all the legal maneuvering in the world couldn't have done. Garrett came in from the pasture that evening with his jaw set and went directly to the bunkhouse without eating, and Cole, who talked too much in ordinary circumstances, didn't say a word at supper. Marlowe looked at the cattle when they came in and felt something cold and very specific. Not grief exactly. More like the confirmation of a thing she'd suspected about how a man like Crow moved in the world, without hesitation, without the friction of considering what the damage cost the people on the other side of it. That was the thing that made him dangerous. He wasn't reckless. He was deliberate, and he simply didn't factor the harm into his calculations. That evening, she asked Beckett about the water diversion. The sheriff's office is documenting it, he said. It'll be part of the case against Crow. How long until the diversion gets repaired? Few days. Maybe a week if we need authorization from the land office first. The creek needs to be back at full flow before the dry season gets worse, she said. The east pasture's already stressed. Another 2 weeks at reduced water and we'll start losing animals. He looked at her for a moment. I know. I'm not questioning whether you know, she said. I'm asking if there's anything I can do to move the authorization faster. He was quiet. She could see him working through something. Then he said, You know anyone at the land office? No. But I know how to make a written case for emergency authorization that's harder to table than a verbal request. She'd done it once in Hester County, for a neighbor whose irrigation rights were being contested. The neighbor had eventually won, 3 months later, and 10 pounds lighter from the stress. But the written record had been the thing that moved it. Do it, Beckett said. So she did that. She wrote the authorization request that evening, clear and specific and organized in the way bureaucratic documents need to be organized to be taken seriously, and sent it with Cole to the land office the next morning, with instructions for Cole to wait for an acknowledgement receipt and bring it back. Cole came back with the receipt and the information that the officer he'd spoken to had read the document immediately rather than setting it aside, which was about as good a result as she could have expected. 3 days later, the authorization came through, and Beckett's men spent the better part of 2 days breaking down the diversion berm and restoring the creek to its original channel. She watched from the hill above the site and she counted the hours the water took to reach normal levels at the main pasture gauge, which was longer than she'd hoped and shorter than she'd feared. The problem she hadn't solved yet was Decker. She'd been thinking about him in the way she thought about any complicated problem, not trying to fix it before she understood it, but circling it carefully, noting what she knew and what she didn't. What she knew was that he was Beckett's foreman, had been for 6 years, and that Beckett trusted him with the kind of deep instinctual trust that develops between men who've worked hard ground together. What she knew was that Decker resented her, not because she'd done anything to him directly, but because her presence, her competence, her access to Beckett's decision-making had shifted a dynamic he'd been comfortable in. That was the kind of resentment that didn't yield to argument, because it wasn't based on anything she could rebut. What she didn't know was whether Decker would eventually come around, or whether this was the fixed, permanent kind, the kind that calcified and then looked for opportunity. She got a partial answer on a Thursday afternoon, 11 days after the sheriff's visit, when she came around the corner of the main barn and walked into a conversation she hadn't been meant to hear. Decker was talking to Garrett, which was ordinary enough, but his voice had the lowered quality of a man who was choosing his volume, and what she heard before she could either announce herself or move away was, doesn't matter what she found, she's still not one of us. Callahan's letting her run the books like she owns the place, and when this all settles out, he'll realize he gave too much ground too fast, and then what? She's dug in. That's what she's doing. You can see it. Garrett said something she couldn't make out. Watch, Decker said. That's all I'm saying. She moved deliberately then, scuffed her boot on the ground, and Decker turned and saw her, and the conversation stopped with the specific quality of a conversation that knows it's been heard. She looked at him. He looked back. Decker, she said, perfectly civil. She walked past them and into the barn, and she stood there for a moment in the grain-smelling dark, and she let herself feel what she felt, which was tired, and something she didn't quite have a name for, not hurt, not exactly. More like the disappointment of a wager you'd placed on an outcome that came in wrong. She knew she wasn't going to cry about it. That wasn't the kind of woman she was. She put it away and went to look at the feed inventory she'd come to check, and she counted sacks and made her notes, and walked back out into the afternoon without looking for Decker. But she thought, I need to understand what that man is capable of, because he's not done. The drought intensified in the third week of June. It came in the way serious weather always comes in that territory, not suddenly but with a kind of patient advance, each day a little hotter and a little stiller than the one before, the sky taking on that flat, bleached quality that means the clouds have given up. The creek held at the restored level, which was something, but the pasture grass went dry faster than any of them had anticipated, and Beckett and Decker spent long days trying to rotate the herds through the remaining green sections in a pattern that would keep the animals fed without destroying the good grass too quickly. Marlowe was tracking the feed costs and the cattle weights in a ledger she'd started keeping separately from the main accounts, because what she was watching was a real-time picture of how fast the operation was burning through reserves, and she needed to be able to present that picture clearly if she needed to argue for a decision that wasn't going to be popular. The decision came into focus on a Sunday evening when she finished the week's calculation and looked at the number at the bottom of the column. At the current rate of expenditure and the current rate of pasture degradation, the ranch had approximately 9 weeks of sustainable feed before they'd be in trouble. 9 weeks assumed no new losses, no additional unexpected costs, and weather that didn't get worse. None of those assumptions were reliable. She looked at the number for a long time. Then she went to find Beckett. He was at the desk in the small room off the main hall that served as his working office, going through correspondence. She put the ledger in front of him, and she showed him the number, and she let him look at it without speaking, because she'd learned that he needed a moment with new information before he was ready to respond to it. When he looked up, he said 9 weeks, at best, she said, if conditions hold. Conditions aren't going to hold. No, they're not. He leaned back in his chair. What are you thinking? She'd been thinking it through since she finished the calculation. We sell 40 head from the north herd. The drought premiums already depressed the market, so we'll take a loss per head, but selling now is better than selling in 6 weeks when everyone in the territory is selling and the price drops further. We use what that brings in to buy supplemental feed from the Grannis operation in the South County. They had a good first half harvest and they've got stores. I can write to them this week. He was looking at her with the careful, considering expression that had become, over the past weeks, one she could read relatively well. Decker's going to say we should hold the north herd. Decker's wrong, she said. Not because he doesn't know cattle, he does, but because he's thinking about the animals in isolation, and I'm thinking about the operation as a whole. You can't keep the north herd and run out of feed in 6 weeks. I know. He was quiet for another moment. You want to handle the Grannis letter? Yes, then write it. He looked back at the ledger. I'll talk to Decker about the north herd. I'd like to be there for that conversation, she said. He looked up. Why? Because I need Decker to understand that this decision came from both of us, and that I'm not going away, and that avoiding that reality isn't a strategy that's available to him anymore. She didn't say any of that, she said, because I know the numbers better than anyone, and if he has questions about the calculation, I can answer them accurately. Beckett considered that. All right, he said, tomorrow morning. Conversation with Decker was worse than she'd expected and better than she'd feared, which was about the most you could say for it. He listened to Beckett lay out the plan, and his face went through several positions: objection, recalculation, reluctant assessment, something that was close to acknowledgement, and he asked several technical questions about the feed calculation that she answered without editorializing, because the answers were self-evidently correct, and she didn't need to add anything to them. At the end, he said, it's a hard call on the north herd. Yes, Beckett said. Decker looked at Marlowe for a second. You're sure about the timeline? I'm sure about the numbers, she said. The timeline is contingent on conditions. If we get rain in the next 2 weeks, the picture changes. But I don't plan for best-case conditions. He was quiet for a moment, looking at something in the middle distance between her and the wall behind her. Then he said, all right, in a voice that was not warm and not hostile, and he left to start moving the north herd. She stood in the office after he'd gone, with Beckett still at the desk, and she was aware that something had happened that was not quite a victory and not quite an accommodation. Something more provisional than either, but real. "He's not going to like you," Beckett said. "I know." "Not for a while, I know that too." She picked up her ledger. "That's fine. He doesn't need to like me. He needs to listen to the numbers." Beckett looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. "You mean that?" he said, and it was somewhere between a question and an observation. "Yes," she said. She went to write the Grannis letter, and the afternoon moved on, and the ranch continued its complicated, imperfect grinding forward, and she thought, "We are not winning. We are surviving." And sometimes surviving is what winning looks like from the inside. The letter from Grannis came back faster than she'd expected 3 days, which meant someone over there had read her communication with more urgency than she'd allowed herself to hope for. The terms were reasonable, not generous. Grannis was a businessman, and a drought premium worked both ways, but they were workable. And she wrote back accepting and confirming the delivery arrangement and the payment schedule, which she had already fit into the cash flow projection she was maintaining. She showed Beckett the final terms. He read them and said, "You negotiated the delivery cost down." "They padded it," she said. "It's standard. You push back, they adjust." "How'd you know they padded it?" "Because I've handled supply negotiations before," she said. "And because I asked Finch," she stopped. The name landed between them like something dropped. She hadn't meant to invoke him, hadn't been thinking about the weight of it. She'd been thinking about the negotiation and the information she'd gathered to inform it, and for one unguarded moment, she'd simply spoken without filtering. Beckett's expression didn't change significantly. He said, "When did you talk to Finch?" "Before. In the first week when I was trying to understand the supply relationships. He told me the delivery rate Grannis typically quoted versus what he'd accept." She paused. "I didn't know then what I know now." "Right," Beckett said. He looked at the letter again. "The terms are fine. Move forward." She moved forward. But she carried the moment with her for the rest of the day, turning it over in the specific, uncomfortable way you turn over moments that reveal something about the limits of your own judgment. Not a mistake exactly, but a reminder that she was operating in a landscape she didn't fully know yet, with people she was still learning, and that confidence in the numbers was not the same as confidence in everything. It was the kind of thing that would have been useful to remember a few weeks later, when the situation changed faster than she was prepared for. The evening of the 22nd day after the sheriff's visit, Beckett came in from the South Range later than usual, and she could tell from the way he came through the door that something had happened. Not an emergency as pace was controlled, but something that had changed the shape of his thinking. He sat down at the kitchen table and she put a cup of coffee in front of him without being asked, which was something she'd started doing in the second week. Not as a domestic performance, but because it was a practical way to buy a moment of transition before a conversation, and she'd noticed he used it. "Crow sent a man today," Beckett said. She sat down. "What kind of man?" "A lawyer, young one. Came out to the south fence with a letter and a very careful explanation of why the legal case against Crow was going to be considerably harder than the sheriff's initial assessment suggested." He put his hands around the cup. "He's claiming the water diversion was an error by a subcontractor, that the cattle removal was carried out by men acting outside their authorization. That Finch's statement is the self-serving testimony of a man trying to reduce his own exposure." She was quiet for a moment. "Is any of that arguable?" The lawyer seemed to think so. "That's not what I asked." Beckett looked at her. "Technically? Maybe. The subcontractor claim is thin but not impossible to construct. Cattle removal being unauthorized, that's harder to argue. But if Crow's men won't testify against him, they won't, then we're relying on what we observed, which is what his lawyer's going to challenge. What about Finch's statement? Finch is a man who betrayed the person he worked for. Whatever he says, Crow's lawyer is going to spend 30 minutes making that the only thing the court remembers." He paused. "I've seen this before. Crow is rich enough to make truth expensive." Marlowe looked at her own hands on the table. She was thinking about the ledger, about the 14 months of payments, the careful recurring pattern of them, about the water diversion measurements she'd recorded before they broke the berm, about the tracks which she'd documented in writing with dates. "He can make truth expensive," she said. "He can't make it disappear if the documentation is thorough enough." She looked up. "I want to go back through everything we have and build a full timeline. Every piece of evidence, every date, every connection, in writing with references. The kind of document a court looks at and finds it harder to dismiss than a series of individual claims." "That'll take time," he said. "Yes," she said, "it will. But Crow's lawyer coming out here today, that's not confidence. That's an attempt to make us feel like we have less than we do." She paused. "We need to decide whether we believe him." Beckett was quiet for a long time. The kitchen was very still. Outside, somewhere distant, one of the horses moved against its stall, a rhythmic knock of hoof on wood. I don't believe him, Beckett said finally. Neither do I, she said. Then we build the document. Yes, she said, we do. He drank his coffee and she got paper from the sitting room, and they sat at the kitchen table until well past 10 o'clock, and she asked questions and he provided what he knew. She wrote it all down in her careful, organized hand, and neither of them mentioned how strange it was to be sitting there together working like that. Or if they thought about it, neither of them said so. She didn't say so because she was paying attention to the work, and because some things, once named, become something other than what they are, and she wasn't ready for that yet. She kept writing instead. The document took 4 days to build properly. Marlowe worked on it the way she worked on the accounts, methodically, without rushing, because rushing was how things got missed and she could not afford to miss anything. She organized it in sections: the water diversion, with dates and measurements, and the land office authorization that had confirmed the illegality of the berm's placement, the cattle removal, with the documented evidence from the south fence, recovery location, and the sheriff's report, the financial sabotage, with the Voss payment records cross-referenced against Crow's operational timeline, and Finch's statement, which she placed last and framed carefully, because she knew Crow's lawyer was right that it was vulnerable, and the only way to handle a vulnerable piece of evidence was to surround it with enough corroboration that it didn't need to stand alone. Beckett read through the completed document on a Thursday evening, taking his time, going back to certain sections twice. When he finished, he set it on the desk and was quiet for a moment. "This is thorough," he said. "It needs to be," she said. "I meant it as a compliment." She looked at him. He was not a man who produced compliments frequently or casually, and she'd learned to receive them without deflecting, which had taken some practice. "Thank you," she said. "I'm going to take this to a territorial attorney," he said. "Not the local man Summian from the county seat who handles land cases. I want his assessment before we submit anything formally." "That's the right call," she said. He sent for the attorney the following morning. The man arrived 2 days later, a spare, older man named Holt, the careful, economical manner of someone who'd spent decades measuring his words against what they were worth, and he sat with the document for most of an afternoon and came out of it with the kind of contained, professional enthusiasm that meant he thought they had something real. "This establishes pattern," Holt said, looking at Beckett across the sitting room table. "Individual incidents can be argued as error or coincidence. What you have here is a connected sequence. That's harder to dismantle." Crow's lawyer suggested the subcontractor defense, Beckett said. "It's a standard deflection," Holt said, "and it might work on individual charges. What it doesn't work on is 14 months of payments to Crow's man running through your own accounts. That's not a subcontractor error. That's a conspiracy to defraud." He paused. Whoever assembled this understood what they were building. Beckett glanced at Marlowe, who was sitting at the far end of the table, and then looked back at Holt. "She did," he said. Holt looked at her with the mildly recalibrating expression of a man encountering an unexpected variable. "Then she should be at the filing," he said. "She can speak to the documentation chain better than anyone." Marlowe said she would be there. After Holt left, Beckett went out to the east pasture to check on the herd rotation. Marlowe sat at the kitchen table alone for a while with her coffee going cold, and she thought about what being at the filing meant and what it would look like to the town and to the ranch hands and to Decker, who was going to hear about it, and she thought, let him hear. She'd run out of energy for managing how things looked. She was going to do what needed doing and let the looks come. She was still sitting there when Beulah came in to start supper, and Beulah looked at her the way Beulah sometimes looked at her now. Not warmly, exactly, but with a different quality than the early weeks. Something more provisional. A woman who had revised her assessment to uncertain rather than concluded. And she said, "Holt staying for supper?" "He left," Marlowe said. "Good," Beulah said. "He's the kind of man who doesn't eat enough and then acts superior about it." Marlowe almost laughed. She turned it into a sound that was ambiguous enough to be polite and went back to her coffee. The filing happened on a Monday at the county seat, in a building that smelled of old paper and institutional patience. Holt led it. Beckett sat at the table in the formal way of a man who owned land and was not going to be made to feel otherwise by the specific quality of wood-paneled rooms. Marlowe sat beside him with the document and spoke when Holt indicated she should, clearly and without excess, and the recording clerk wrote down what she said with the careful, neutral face of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by anything. Crow's response came in 8 days later, a counterfiling, voluminous and expensive-looking, that did exactly what they'd anticipated. It challenged Finch's credibility, characterized the South Fence incident as unauthorized action, by men Crow claimed to have immediately terminated, and introduced an engineering report from a man in Abilene who had apparently determined that the water berm was a natural formation resulting from soil erosion. Marlowe read the engineering report 3 times. It's not a bad document, she told Beckett that evening. Technically. He found someone to say the words correctly. Can we rebut it? Yes. But we need our own engineer, and we need him to have been at the site before we dismantled the berm. She paused. I have the measurements I took and the photographs. Photographs of what? I had Cole take photographs, she said, the day before the demolition crew went in. I asked him to, and he did, and I have them in the file. She got up and retrieved the folder, found the photograph, 6 of them, clear enough to show the constructed quality of the packed earth and stone berm in detail that no natural erosion process would produce, and put them on the table. Beckett looked at them for a long time. You had him take these without telling me, he said. Not accusatory, just noting it. I told you we needed documentation, she said. The photographs were part of that. He was quiet. Then he said, I'm not complaining. I know you're not, she said. I'm explaining. He looked up from the photographs. Something passed across his face that she noticed but couldn't quite categorize. Not quite amusement, not quite respect. Something that occupied the territory between those two things, where a man finds himself when he's been surprised by someone and has decided not to be bothered by it. He sent the photographs to Holt that week. Holt wrote back that they were, in his words, definitive in a way that will be difficult to argue around, and that the engineering report from Abilene was likely to be withdrawn quietly in the next few weeks. Marlowe filed that letter in the folder and allowed herself exactly 1 moment of satisfaction, which was the amount she thought was appropriate, and then she went back to the feed ledger because the drought was still ongoing, and Crow's legal strategy was not the only thing trying to take them down. The storm came without sufficient warning. The territory had been building to it for a week in the flat, pressured way that veterans of that land recognized but couldn't always explain, a quality in the air, a stillness that was too complete, animals restless without apparent cause. Beckett watched the sky and said the word weather twice in 4 days, in the particular way of a man who means more than the word contains, and Decker started moving the most vulnerable cattle to the closer pastures, which was the right call, and which neither of them acknowledged to each other. It came on a Tuesday evening in the last week of June, and it did not come as rain. The dust storm rolled in from the southwest, with the speed and density of something solid, a wall of orange-brown moving across the plains that swallowed the horizon and kept coming. Marlowe had been walking back from the cookhouse when the air pressure changed in the specific, physical way that means run, and she ran, and she was inside the main house with the door shut, and her heart going hard when the first wave of it hit, a sound like everything at once, wind and grit, and the deep structural groan of the barns taking the force of it. Through the window, which she could barely see through, she could make out shapes moving. The hands were out there. Beckett was out there. She could see lanterns swinging in the dark in the chaos, which meant people were still moving and not incapacitated. And she stood at the window and tried to see more and couldn't. She was not someone who waited easily. She had never been that. But she understood the particular mathematics of a situation where going out into the storm added one more variable to an already chaotic system, and she stayed, and she thought, and she watched. The first shout came from near the east barn. She couldn't make out words, only the quality of alarm, the pitch of it, and then she saw the orange against the brown dark, and her chest contracted hard. Fire the east barn, she was out the door before she decided to be. The wind hit her like a wall of grit and pressure, and she turned her face and kept moving, squinting through the dust toward the orange that was getting larger and more certain. The barnside's wall had caught. She could see that much, and the hands were already there, some of them with water, some of them pulling animals out of the near stalls, moving in the disorganized way of people managing an emergency in conditions that made organized anything nearly impossible. She looked for Beckett and found him at the pump, working it with 2 of the hands, and even from a distance she could see something was wrong with his shoulder, the way he was moving, one arm not quite full range, compensating with the other side. She started toward him, and he saw her and shouted something she couldn't hear over the wind. She cupped her hands around her mouth. Are you hurt? He shook his head. She didn't fully believe him. She got to him, and he turned long enough for her to see his face, which was tight in a way that was not just effort, and she said, your shoulder. Later he said, the south herd. They're moving toward the ridge. She turned and looked south, and the dust made it hard to see much, but she could hear them. The cattle, more of them than she'd expected this close, moving in the panicked, close-pressed way of animals that have lost their direction and are following momentum instead of instinct. In a dust storm, momentum pointed the wrong way was how you lost a herd off a cliff. How many toward the ridge? She said. Garrett says most of the south herd. 200, maybe more. He was still working the pump, jaw tight. I've got 3 men trying to turn them, but the wind's against. The Dunmore Canyon, she said. He looked at her. I found it in the 3rd week, she said, when I was riding the east boundary. It's an abandoned route, through the lower hill wide enough for cattle, sheltered on three sides. If you get them into the canyon mouth, the walls cut the wind and they'll naturally slow and compact. She was already thinking about the approach. It's a mile and a half south of the ridge approach. If they're still moving, there's time to redirect. You found a canyon, he said, not doubting exactly. Just the moment between hearing something and knowing what to do with it. I explore, she said. I told you I noticed things. He looked at her for a second, 1 second, with the storm moving around them and the fire behind them, making the night orange and grit and wrong. Then he said, can you get there ahead of them? Not on foot, she said. Take Remy, his horse, the dark one with no particular markings. Fast and sure-footed, which was what mattered. She's in the near corral, north side. They haven't spooked that group yet. Marlowe was already moving. She'd ridden in worse conditions once. Years before, when her father's farm was flooding and they'd had to move the stock in rain so hard it was physical. And she'd learned from that night that the worst thing you could do in an emergency on horseback was fight the animal. You told the horse what you needed, and you trusted the horse's sense of the ground, which was better than yours in the dark, and you held on and kept your direction and let the collaboration happen. Remy was a better horse than she'd expected, calmer in the storm than any animal had a right to be, moving with a sureness that said this horse had seen rough weather and did not find it remarkable. She pushed south along the fence line, the wind at a brutal angle across her face, and she counted landmarks she'd memorized on her exploratory rides, the three-post corner junction, the dry wash that ran east-west, the cluster of scrubby cedars that marked the property boundary turn. She could hear the herd before she could see them. Specific sound of cattle in mass movement, hooves and breath, and the low, driven sound of animals operating on fear came through even the wind, and she adjusted her angle to bring herself in front of their direction of travel, which was the dangerous part, because you could be wrong about where they were headed and end up in the middle of them rather than in front. She wasn't wrong. She came around the cedar cluster, and there they were, visible in flashes through the dust, a dark, moving mass, several dozen head in the vanguard, with more behind, moving at the fast, uncontrolled pace of a herd that has passed the point where individual animals are making decisions and has become something collective and mindless. The canyon mouth was 300 yards to the west. She could see it, or she could see the outline of it, the gap in the low hills where the walls came together, and she thought, if I can angle the lead animals, the rest follow. She rode across the front of the herd at a distance that felt too close and that Beckett would have objected to had he been able to see it, cutting back and forth in the direction she needed them to move, using Remy's presence and the motion and the noise of it to function as a moving wall on one side. The lead animals balked and shifted. She pushed again. One of them moved west, then three more, then a group. She did this for what felt like 20 minutes and was probably closer to 8, riding in the grit and the dark and the noise. And her arms were going tired from the sustained tension of it, and her eyes were streaming from the dust. And she kept moving because stopping was worse. The canyon mouth opened in front of her and the first animals went in. When cattle find shelter in a storm, they know it. The moment the canyon walls rose on either side and the wind cut from a wall to a low moan, the animals slowed. The ones behind pushed forward, but the packed space and the sudden reduction in wind resistance did what she'd calculated it would. The herd compacted and slowed and milled and stopped running. Not every animal made it into the canyon in those first minutes. She could hear the ones still outside. And there were voices now. Other voices. Garrett, she thought, and maybe Pruitt, working the outer edge, but the majority of the south herd was inside those walls, and it was not going off the ridge. She pulled Remy up at the canyon mouth, and she sat there for a moment in the reduced wind, and she breathed. Remy was blowing hard, sides heaving, but sound. Marlowe was aware that her hands were shaking slightly, which happened sometimes after sustained fear-fueled effort when the body made its accounting. She pressed her palms flat against the saddle and waited for the shaking to stop. It did, it always did. Garrett found her 20 minutes later, coming in from the east side of the canyon with two of the other hands, and when he saw the herd compacted and calming in the shelter of the walls, and then saw her at the mouth, he stopped and looked at her in a way she'd seen men look at things they hadn't predicted. You got them in here, he said, not a question. Most of them, she said. The outer group needs collecting, but they're not going toward the ridge anymore. Garrett looked at the canyon walls, at the herd, and then back at her. How'd you know this was here? I rode the east boundary 3 weeks ago, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that was good thinking. She recognized that for what it was, a man giving her credit in the economical, straightforward way of someone who doesn't make a performance of it, which was the most genuine kind. And she said, let's get the outside animals secured. They worked for another hour in the diminishing edge of the storm, and by the time the worst of the wind had passed, and the dust was settling into a low, gritty haze, They had the outer group consolidated near the canyon entrance, and Garrett had sent Cole back to report to Beckett. Marlowe stayed with the herd because someone needed to, and because she didn't know what she'd find when she went back, and she preferred to be useful while she was deciding. The fire she'd half forgotten the fire in the immediate urgency of the cattle. She looked north and could see the glow was less than it had been, which meant either they'd gotten it under control or there was less left to burn. Neither of those was a good option, but one was better than the other. Pruitt came over at some point and stood near her without talking, which was something she'd come to appreciate about Pruitt. He didn't fill silence with words when words weren't needed. They stood at the canyon mouth together and watched the herd settle, and the night go from orange-brown to a more ordinary kind of dark. "You ride well," Pruitt said eventually. "My mother taught me," she said. He nodded, as though that explained something, and went back to watching the cattle. She found Beckett near the remains of the east barn at close to 2 in the morning. The fire was out, the barn was not. 3 of the 4 walls were standing, charred and structural but holding, and the roof had come down on the east end and was a tangle of burned timber and corrugated metal that steamed faintly in the post-storm air. The smell was the particular heavy smell of wet burned wood, which is different from dry burned wood, and worse in a way that's hard to articulate. It settles into the back of the throat. Beckett was sitting on a water trough with his jacket off, and in the lamplight she could see what he'd been hiding. Since the middle of the storm, his right shoulder was wrong. Not broken. The way he was holding it was too controlled for broken, but badly wrenched muscle damage that was going to be weeks of problems. She sat down beside him without being invited. He didn't object. "The south herd secured," she said. He looked at her. In the lamplight, his face was striped with grit and effort, and something that might have been relief, or might have been a complicated feeling that relief was only one part of. "Garrett said you rode them into a canyon." "I redirected them," she said. "The canyon did the work." "A canyon you found 3 weeks ago." "Yes." He looked at his shoulder. "How many did we lose?" "I don't have a full count yet. I want daylight for that." She looked at the barn. "The barn can be rebuilt. The east wall looks structurally intact. We'll need to assess the foundation before we start, but it's not a loss." "How many of the animals did we have in there?" 12, she said. Beulah had them moved to the near corral yesterday for the temperature. She noticed they were showing heat stress. A pause. She was right, he absorbed that. So Beulah saved 12 head, and the corral held. He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way, but the motion was there. "And you saved the south herd," he said. "Garrett and Pruitt helped. The outside animals." "You know that's not what I mean," he said. She looked at her own hands. "I know." They sat there in the dying smell of the fire for a while without talking, and it was a different kind of not talking than they'd shared before. Not the careful, strategic silence of 2 people managing their proximity, but something more like the silence of 2 people who have been through the same hard thing and don't have anything to add to it right now. She said, "Let me look at your shoulder." He didn't argue this time. He just turned slightly to give her access, and she ran her hands along the joint with the focused, practical attention she'd applied to the cut on his hand 6 weeks ago. But it was different now in a way neither of them named. He had a high pain tolerance, she'd already known that, and the only indication of how bad it was came from the slight change in his breathing when she pressed certain points. "Rotator damage," she said. "You need to rest it." "I know. Actually rest it. Not what you think resting is." He turned his head to look at her, and they were closer in proximity than usual because of the angle she needed to examine the shoulder, and he said, "What do I think resting is?" "Doing everything with one arm and refusing to acknowledge the other one exists," she said. "I've been watching you manage for 3 hours. Something in his face shifted. Not quite amusement, more like a man encountering his own behavior described accurately from the outside, and not having an argument available. "I'll rest it," he said. "Good," she said. She moved back to a normal distance. He put his jacket back on carefully, one-armed, and she didn't offer to help because she'd learned the particular line between assistance and the kind of help that feels like management. "Crow's men," he said after a moment. She'd been waiting for that. "What about them, the storm, the fire?" He paused. "Garrett said the barn wall that caught, there wasn't lightning that close. He's sure of it." She thought about what she'd seen in the early part of the storm. The orange against the dust dark, the direction it had been coming from. The fact that the east wall was the wall facing Crow's property. "I can't confirm that," she said carefully. "I didn't see what started it." "Neither did I." He was looking at the ruined roof. "But Crow's lawyer came 8 days ago to tell us our case was weak. And then his men come through in the storm and set fire to my barn." "We don't know." "I know," he said, not loudly. The particular quiet of someone who has moved past doubt and arrived at certainty and is now dealing with what certainty costs. "If you go at him without proof," she said, "you give his lawyer exactly what he needs. A reactive man who acts on anger is easier to defend against than a documented conspiracy. She met his eyes. We've been doing this right. Don't stop now because he pushed us. The silence that followed was the kind she'd learned to let run its course. He thought in silence. She'd gotten used to that. All right, he said finally. I want to search the barn site tomorrow morning, she said. When there's light. If anyone was close enough to that wall to set it, there'll be something. Boot prints, maybe. Something. He looked at her. In the storm's aftermath? There'll be prints everywhere. I know what your hand's boots look like, she said. I've been looking at them for 6 weeks. Something moved through his expression that was quiet and complicated and not quite what she'd expected. Then he said, You're something, Marlowe Hayes. It was the first time he'd used her name. Her name, the one she'd had before the arrangement and the letter and the stage into Red Creek. She noted that, in the specific, careful way, she noted things that mattered and that she was not yet ready to examine too directly. Callahan, she said, and let the correction stand without making it a correction. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, Right, quietly, and he stood up, and they walked back toward the house through the settling dust, and neither of them said anything more, and the night was very still now that the storm had passed. She was up before light. She'd slept 3 hours, which was not enough, and was what was available. And she dressed in the dark without waking the house and went out to the east barn site while the sky was still gray-blue and the stars were just starting to lose their certainty. She moved carefully, staying close to the east wall outside the burn radius. The ground around the barn's exterior was a mess of overlaid prince boots, hooves, the drag marks of the water buckets, and she'd been right that separating them out was going to be tedious work. But she'd also been right that it was possible, because she knew the shoe patterns, and she'd thought about this enough the night before to have a method in mind. She started at the northeast corner, where the damage was worst, and she worked along the wall south. Prints inside the obvious zone, within 10 feet of the wall were all identifiable. Beckett's distinctive wear pattern on the right heel, Garrett's set stride, Cole's smaller boot, the others she knew. 12 feet out from the wall, the ground was more mixed, and she went carefully, looking at depth and pattern and direction. She found the first one at 14 feet from the northeast corner. A single boot print, heel and partial ball, pointing toward the wall. Different wear pattern than any of the hands. The heel was wider, she'd seen that before. Outside the ordinary traffic path, pressed deeper than the surrounding storm chaos prints, which meant it had been made with weight and purpose rather than passing movement. She marked it with a small stone. She found 2 more in the next 20 feet, same pattern. The line of approach clear when she stood back and looked at the 3 stones she'd placed. Someone had come to this corner of the barn, not from the direction of the bunkhouses or the corrals, from the east, from the direction of Crow's land. She stood there in the early gray light and looked at what she had, and she thought about what it proved and what it didn't prove, and how thin the evidential thread was, and how much depended on what came next. Then she went inside and woke Beckett. He came down with his hair not yet organized, and his shoulder held at the slightly elevated angle of someone managing pain before coffee, and she took him out to the site without preamble, and showed him the marked prints and the line of approach, and said, We need the photographer from town, today before any more traffic comes through here. He looked at the prints. He looked at the line they described. He looked at his barn. You think this is enough, he said. I think it's something, she said. I think with what we already have, something might be enough. He straightened up. The early morning light was coming in flat and pale across the eastern hills, and his face in that light was tired and very decided. I'll send for the photographer, he said. Send Pruitt, she said. Cole stopped to talk to someone. He looked at her sideways in a way that said he appreciated the specificity and did not want to admit it fully. I'll send Pruitt. She went to start the coffee, and she was already thinking about the next step, and the step after that, and the step after that. Because the thing she'd understood since the night in the kitchen with the ledger and the name Voss was that this was not a fight that would end cleanly, and that the only way through it was to be more thorough and more patient and more careful than the man on the other side of it. Crow had set fire to the barn in the middle of a storm, which was a desperate move dressed as an opportunistic one. Desperate men make errors. She intended to be present when the errors became visible. The coffee boiled, and she poured 2 cups and waited for the sound of Beckett coming back inside. And outside the ranch was waking up into the hard work of a day after a disaster, which is the less dramatic kind of hard, the kind that asks everything of you without the adrenaline to carry you through it, just will and necessity and the next thing in front of you. She was good at that kind. She had always been better at that kind. Pruitt came back with the photographer by mid-morning. The man's name was Edsel, and he was younger than Marlowe expected, mid-20s, with the serious slightly myopic expression of someone who spent most of his time looking through a lens rather than at the world directly. He arrived with his equipment packed carefully in 2 cases, and he didn't ask many questions, which she appreciated, because what she needed from him was precision rather than conversation. She walked him through the site herself, showing him the marked prints and the line of approach she'd mapped with the small stones. He looked at what she'd laid out, and he nodded in the way of a professional who has been given adequate information and knows what to do with it. He photographed the individual prints at close range, then pulled back for the establishing shots that showed their position relative to the barn wall, then went wider still to capture the directional line from east to northeast corner, which was the thing that mattered. Not just that someone had been there, but where they'd come from and where they'd been going. Beckett watched from a distance, shoulder in a makeshift sling that Marlowe had fashioned that morning from a piece of linen, and that he'd accepted without comment. Decker stood beside him, and she was aware of both of them watching her work with Edsel, and she was aware that what they were seeing was different from what they'd seen 6 weeks ago when she'd arrived on the stage and stood in the dirt street, not knowing anyone. She didn't think about what it meant. She had enough to think about. When Edsel finished, he told her the photographs would be ready in 2 days. She paid him from the household account, wrote it down in the ledger, and watched him pack his equipment and go. Then she turned to the barn site and started the assessment she'd been putting off. What exactly had been lost, what could be salvaged, what the rebuild would cost, and how that cost fit against the current state of the operation's finances, which were not good and were not going to be good for a while. Beckett came over when Edsel was gone. "What are you doing?" "Starting the rebuild estimate," she said, without looking up from the notes she was making. "That's Decker's job." "Decker has enough to manage today," she said. "And I know the materials cost better than he does, because I've been tracking the supply figures." She finally looked up. "If that's a problem, tell me and I'll stop." He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression she'd come to think of as his working out whether to say something face. Then he said, "It's not a problem," and walked back to where Decker was standing. She went back to her notes. The east barn was salvageable. The foundation was sound. The standing walls were structurally viable, and the materials for the roof and the damaged wall were available through the Grannis supply network they'd already established. Her estimate, when she finished it that afternoon, came in at a figure that was difficult but not impossible painful, in the way that fire damage is always painful, but not fatal to the operation. She presented it to Beckett at supper, and he looked at it with the controlled expression of a man absorbing a cost he doesn't like, and that he can nonetheless manage. "We rebuild fast," he said, "before the weather turns again." 4 weeks if we start Monday," she said. "I can have the material order sent this week." "Do it." She did it the following morning, and then she went back to the legal file, because Crow was still out there, and the barn photographs were going to Holt by the end of the week, and she needed to be certain the rest of the documentation was in the clearest possible shape when Holt received them. What she didn't anticipate was the town. She'd been so focused on the ranch and the legal case and the immediate operational problems that she hadn't paid adequate attention to the other thing happening. The thing that was happening in Red Creek itself, in conversations at the dry goods store and the feed merchant's counter, and the small, close-walled spaces where information circulated faster than any newspaper. She got her first real indication of it when she rode into town with Cole on a Wednesday to collect the Edsel photographs and stop at the land office. The woman at the land office counter, a stout, businesslike woman named Adele, whom Marlowe had dealt with twice before, and who had been professionally civil and nothing more, looked at her when she came in and said, "I heard about what you did with the cattle in the storm." Marlowe had been reaching for the folder of documents she'd brought to file. She stopped. "Garrett and Pruitt did most of the outside work." "That's not what Garrett says," Adele said. "He came in Monday to register a survey correction, and he told Frank at the counter about the canyon." She paused. He said, "You rode across the front of a running herd in a dust storm to redirect them." "I redirected them," Marlowe said. "The canyon was the actual solution." Adele looked at her for a moment with an expression Marlowe could not immediately classify. "You know Beckett Callahan has had 3 wives that didn't work," she said. Marlowe had not known that. She absorbed it without showing that she hadn't known. "I wasn't aware of that," she said. 2 of them left. One of them died, which wasn't anyone's fault, just hard country." Adele straightened the papers on her counter. "People in this town had a view of you when you came in on the stage. I want you to know that view is changing." It was a longer speech than Marlowe had expected from a woman who had previously given her the minimum required. She said, "I appreciate you telling me that." "I'm telling you because it's true," Adele said, not to be kind. And then she took the documents Marlowe had come to file and processed them with her usual professional efficiency. And that was the end of the conversation. and Marlowe went out to find Cole and felt something she didn't quite have a name for. Not gratification exactly, something with more complicated edges than that. She collected the photographs from Edsel's studio. They were good, clear, and well composed in the way of a young man who took his work seriously. And she stood in his small studio going through them carefully, making sure each one captured what she needed it to capture. They did. The directional line of the approaching prints was unmistakable. The depth differential between the unknown prints and the storm scatter around them was visible. Edsel had done well. These are exactly right, she told him. He straightened slightly in the way of someone who doesn't receive professional compliments frequently. I can make additional copies if you need them. 2 more sets, she said. 1 for the attorney, 1 to keep here. He made the copies while she waited. She paid him again, documented it again, and rode back to the ranch with the photographs in a flat leather case she held against her body to keep them from bending. Cole rode beside her in his usual way, which was slightly too close on the left side, and with an ongoing commentary about things she half listened to while thinking about the legal file. He said something about a man named Tabor in town who'd had a run-in with one of Crow's hands at the saloon, and she noted that without attaching too much to it, and then Cole said, Garrett told the whole bunkhouse about the canyon. She looked at him. I'm not complaining, Cole said quickly. I'm saying everyone knows. Even Decker knows. What did Decker say about it, she asked. Cole was quiet for a moment, which was unusual enough that she paid attention. He didn't say much, Cole said finally. But he stopped. I don't know how to describe it. Try, she said. Like a man who lost a bet he didn't know he'd made, Cole said. She thought about that for the rest of the ride back. Decker came to find her on a Friday. She was in the small office going through the material order confirmations when she heard him on the porch, and a moment later he knocked on the open door frame in the way of someone who knows the house, but is observing a boundary they've decided to observe. Got a minute, he said. She looked up. Yes. He came in and stood, which was typical. She had never seen Decker choose to sit when he could stand. He held his hat in front of him with both hands, which was not typical, and she recognized that for what it was. A man in a posture he'd deliberately chosen because it communicated something he intended to communicate. She waited. I owe you something, he said. The words came out in the flat, straight way of a man who has been rehearsing them enough to remove the performance from them, which meant he'd been thinking about this for a while. What you did with the cattle, and before that with the water. I said things to Garrett, to Cole, to Callahan that weren't fair, and they were wrong. She looked at him. His face had the particular closed, careful quality of someone not enjoying this, but committed to it anyway. She'd seen that face on men before her father's business associates, when they'd had to correct something in front of someone they'd underestimated. It was not a comfortable face to wear. She respected that he was wearing it. I appreciate you saying that, she said. I'm not saying it to be appreciated, he said. I'm saying it because it's accurate. He paused. You were right about the water. Right about not moving against Crow before we had documentation. Right about the south fence. Another pause, shorter. I've been doing this job for 6 years, and I didn't see what you saw in the first 3 weeks. She put her pen down. You know this ranch in ways I don't, she said. What you know and what I know are not the same things, and they're not competing. They're different kinds of knowing. He looked at her with a slight shift in his expression, as if he'd expected something else and was recalibrating around what he'd gotten. That's a generous way to put it. It's an accurate way to put it, she said. You kept this operation running for 6 years under a man who doesn't ask for help easily in hard conditions. That's not nothing, Decker. That's most of what's standing. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, fair enough, in the careful, even tone of someone who means it more than the tone suggests. He left. She picked up her pen and went back to the material confirmations, and she was aware that something had changed in the structure of the ranch that would take a while to fully understand. But that was, on balance, better than what had been there before. That evening, she told Beckett about Decker's visit. He listened with the concentrated stillness she'd long since stopped interpreting as distance. Then he said, he came to you, yes. He didn't come to me. No, she paused. I think that's the right order, actually. Beckett thought about that. She could see him working it through. Who owed the apology to whom and why? The specific geography of accountability in a workplace where everyone's position had just shifted. You're probably right, he said. I am right, she said, without heat. He looked at her with the expression that had been appearing more frequently, the one she'd initially categorized as recalibration, and that she now thought was something more ongoing than that, less a single adjustment and more a sustained process of attention. How's your shoulder, she said, because she'd been tracking it, and it was better than it had been, and she wanted to establish that before he started using it like it was fine. Better, he said. Better is not healed, she said. I'm aware of the distinction. Make sure you are, she said, and went to check on supper. Holt's response to the photographs came 9 days later, and it was the kind of response that carries weight even in its restraint. He wrote that the photographs, combined with the existing documentation, had altered his assessment of the case's strength materially and in the plaintiff's favor. He wrote that Crow's subcontractor defense was now substantially undermined. He wrote that he had made contact with a colleague at the territory court who had reviewed the consolidated file and had indicated that the weight of documented evidence was sufficient to proceed to a formal hearing at which Crow would be required to respond to specific charges rather than general allegations. He also wrote, in the final paragraph, that he had heard from a source at the county seat that Crow was aware the case had strengthened and that this awareness was producing a particular kind of behavior in Crow that Holt characterized as reactive positioning. He didn't elaborate on what that meant, which she found more concerning than if he had. She read the letter twice and took it to Beckett. He read it once, carefully, and when he finished, he said, "Reactive positioning." "I know," she said. "That means he's going to do something." "Yes," she said. "The question is what?" She sat down across from him. "He's tried legal pressure, financial sabotage, cattle theft, and arson. The first 3 haven't worked. The arson gave us evidence instead of taking it from us. He's running out of approaches that don't cost him more than they cost us." "Desperation isn't a comfort," Beckett said. "No," she said. "It's a warning." She'd been thinking about this since she read the letter the first time. "What does Crow have left that he hasn't used?" Beckett looked at his desk. "People," he said. "He still has people in this county who owe him." "Who?" "Tabor at the stockyard owes him a debt financial from 3 years back. The Marlowe brothers run the feed transport south of town, and they've done exclusive work for Crow for years. There are hands on other properties who worked Crow's range before he stopped." "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that legal exposure changes calculations," she said. "A man who owes Crow a financial debt is one thing. A man who could be named as connected to an arson investigation is another thing entirely. Some of those people are going to start reconsidering their position." He looked at her with sharp attention. "You want to talk to them?" "I want to understand the landscape," she said. "If Crow's network is starting to fracture, we need to know before he does." She paused. "And if it isn't fracturing, we need to know that too." He was quiet for a moment. "That's delicate, yes," she said. "You'd need to be careful about how it looks. If it looks like we're trying to build a counter-network." "I'm not going to go build a network," she said. "I'm going to go talk to Adele at the land office and see what she knows, and maybe ride out to the Morrow operation and have a look at their books for the water transport contract they do for the county, which is a matter of public record." She met his eyes. Information isn't the same thing as maneuvering. He thought about that for a moment. Then he said, "Take Garrett." "I was going to take Garrett," she said. Adele knew more than Marlowe had expected, and she gave it more freely than Marlowe had anticipated, which told her something about the state of Red Creek's opinion on the matter of Silas Crow. The town, it turned out, had a longer and more specific history with Crow than Marlowe had known. He'd bought out 3 smaller properties in the past 8 years through methods that the people involved had found objectionable but had lacked the resources to contest. He had a controlling interest in the water transport company that served the southern county, which gave him leverage over properties whose supply chains ran through that system. There had been a dispute 6 years ago before Beckett's water diversion, before any of the current situation over grazing rights on federal land adjacent to the territory border, and Crow had won it through legal pressure that had left 2 families with no real recourse and considerably less land than they'd started with. "People here are not fond of Crow," Adele said. She said it with the precise, contained quality of a woman making an understatement deliberately. "They've been afraid of him," Marlowe said. "They've been practical about him," Adele said, "which is different. When a man controls enough of what you need, anger is a luxury." And now Adele looked at her steadily. "Now people are watching what you're doing, Mrs. Callahan, and they're asking themselves whether what you're doing is going to work." She paused. "If it does, the calculus changes for a lot of people in this county. And if it doesn't," Marlowe said, "then Crow ends up with the Callahan property and everyone goes back to being practical." Adele straightened the papers on her counter, the habitual gesture Marlowe had come to recognize as her way of punctuating a statement she considered complete. So it had better work. Marlowe rode out to the Morrow operation that afternoon with Garrett, who was useful company in the specific way of a man who was physically capable and professionally present, and who did not fill silence with irrelevant observations. The Morrow brothers turned out to be 2 men in their 50s, one thin and one broad, both weathered in the permanent way of outdoor work, and they received her with a guarded courtesy that she recognized as men who knew who she was and were waiting to see what she wanted before deciding how to feel about it. She asked about the county water transport contract. She asked about it in the specific, detailed way that made clear she'd read the public record and understood what she was looking at, and she watched the Morrow brothers exchange a glance that contained a conversation she wasn't part of. The thinner one, Clarence said, "That contract's due for renewal next quarter." "I know," she said, and Crow submitted to be the primary handler again. Another glance between them. The broader one, Gerald said, "We submitted too." "I know that as well," she said. She paused. "The county commissioner's office is going to be reviewing all submissions in the context of the current legal proceedings against Crow. I thought you should know that, in case it affects how you're thinking about your own position." It was carefully stated, nothing that could be characterized as a promise or a threat, nothing that went beyond what was factually true. The legal proceedings were real. The commissioner's office would review them. Those things were both accurate. The Morrow brothers were quiet for a long moment. Then Gerald said, "We heard about what you did with the storm and the cattle." "Garrett and Pruitt did most of that," she said. "That's not what Garrett says," Gerald said, and the directness of it, the way it echoed what Adele had told her without any coordination between them, struck her as more significant than any single statement. She rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon with Garrett, and she didn't say much, and Garrett didn't push for conversation, and she thought about what she'd gathered, and what it meant, and what came next. What came next was Crow himself. She hadn't anticipated that. She'd been thinking about legal maneuvers and documentation, and the slow, careful reconstruction of an evidentiary case that would withstand a territorial court, and she had not accounted for the possibility that Crow would simply arrive. He came on a Thursday, which was 12 days after Holt's letter, and 3 days after her visits to Adele and the Morrow brothers. He came with two men who weren't quite ranch hands and weren't quite lawyers, that category of functionary that existed in the gray territory between work and enforcement, men whose usefulness depended on their size and their willingness to be present. Beckett was at the south pasture when they arrived. Marlowe was at the desk in the office when she heard horses and came to the window and saw who it was. She had one clear, immediate thought. "Beckett is not here, and I am not going to send for him, and let this man see that his timing was not accidental." She went to the front door. Crow was heavier than she'd expected from the way Beckett described him, broad through the chest, with a face that had once been handsome and was now merely authoritative, the kind of face that was used to producing a particular effect, and was mildly surprised when it didn't. He dismounted with the ease of someone comfortable on horseback, and he stood in the yard and looked at the house and then at her with an expression that was managing to be both cordial and evaluative. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, "I was hoping to speak with your husband." "He's at the south pasture," she said. "Can I help you?" It was a simple question, and she said it simply, and she was watching him process it. The fact of her standing in the doorway rather than going to fetch Beckett, the absence of deference in her voice, the directness of the question. "I came to make a proposal," Crow said, "a business one. I thought it might be worth discussing before this legal situation gets further out of hand." "I'm sure my husband would be happy to hear any proposal," she said. "You're welcome to wait. He should be back within the hour." She was not going to invite him into the house. She stood in the doorway and she waited, and Crow looked at her with a different quality, now recalibrating in the specific way of a man who expected to encounter one kind of situation and has found another. "You're the one who put the legal case together," he said. It was not a question. "I contributed," she said. "That's not what Holt's office thinks," he said. "The word is that the documentation is unusually thorough, that someone went to considerable trouble to connect things that could have stayed separate." He paused. "I understand you've also been speaking with people in town." She held his gaze and she said nothing, which was often more effective than anything she could have said. He shifted his weight slightly, a small movement that told her something. "I want you to understand that the situation can be resolved," he said, "without a territorial court proceeding. There are terms available that would be fair to both parties." "That would be a conversation for my husband," she said. "Your husband and I have a history," Crow said. "I thought it might be useful to speak with someone who doesn't." "I'm not someone's without history," she said. "I'm the person who documented 14 months of fraudulent payments from this ranch's accounts to your operations manager. I'm the person who photographed the prints your men left at the east barn before the fire." She kept her voice level. "I don't think I'm the person you want to negotiate with, Mr. Crow. I think you want my husband because you believe you can manage him more easily than you can manage me." The silence that followed was the kind that has a quality to it, taut and specific and directed. Crow looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that was not quite anger and not quite respect, and that occupied the uncomfortable territory between those two things. "You're very sure of yourself," he said. "I'm sure of the documentation," she said, "which is not the same thing, but in this situation it produces similar results." He looked at her for another moment, and then he said, "Tell your husband I came by." And he went back to his horse, and he mounted, and he and his two men rode back the way they'd come. She stood in the doorway and watched them go, and she was aware that her heartbeat had been elevated for the entire conversation and was only now returning to something closer to normal. Her hands were steady, which was the thing that mattered. She went inside and wrote down every word of the exchange while it was precise in her memory. Dates, times, exact phrasing. She put it in the legal file. When Beckett came back that evening, she told him immediately, because she'd decided in the moment that she would, that the decision to handle the conversation herself had been the right one, but that the content of it belonged to both of them. He listened without interrupting, which she'd come to appreciate, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "He came here himself." Yes, he doesn't do that. He looked at the file she'd put the written account into. The last time Crow came to anyone directly was 6 years ago, when he made the Jensen family an offer they didn't have the resources to refuse. He paused. He was scared enough to come here himself. "Yes," she said. "And you turned him around and sent him back." "I told him the conversation was yours to have," she said carefully. "I didn't turn him away. I redirected him." Beckett looked at her with an expression that had become, over the past weeks, increasingly difficult to categorize in the limited vocabulary she'd initially applied to it. "Same result," he said. "Similar result," she said. "Different meaning." He shook his head slightly, not in disagreement, more in the way of a man processing something that continues to be more than he's fully accounted for. "What do you think he's prepared to offer?" "I think he's prepared to offer enough money to make the legal situation go away," she said. "A purchase price that looks generous until you think about what the property is worth without his interference depressing its value. And I think he's counting on the fact that a long territorial court proceeding is expensive and exhausting, and that most people in your position would take the money and be done with it. And what do you think we should do?" She looked at him steadily. "I think we should finish the legal case," she said. "I think we should take it all the way to the territorial court and put every piece of documentation in front of a judge and let it speak for itself. I think Crow coming here himself is the clearest sign yet that the case is as strong as Holt says it is." She paused. "And I think if we take his money now, we spend the rest of our time on this property waiting for the next angle of attack. Because he doesn't stop. He just finds a new approach." Beckett was quiet for a long moment. The evening had settled into the particular warm stillness that came after the heat of the day backed off, and outside she could hear the ranch making its end-of-day sounds horses, the distant voice of one of the hands, the cookhouse. "Then we finish it," he said. "Yes," she said. She got out the legal file, and they sat together at the desk and went through what they had and what was still needed, and it was the most natural thing in the world by now. This particular kind of sitting together, the work between them more legible than anything else, the question of what else might be between them a thing they were both, for now, choosing not to examine too directly. The territorial court hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out, which was not soon, and was not enough time, and was what they had. In those 6 weeks, 3 things happened that Marlowe had anticipated, and one that she hadn't. She'd anticipated that Holt would need additional documentation, because legal cases always require more than you think, and she provided it without complaint additional notarized statements. A corrected timeline of the water diversion, a supplementary financial analysis of the Voss payments that traced the money's likely destination with more specificity than the original documentation had achieved. She'd anticipated that Crow's lawyer would make a second formal challenge to Finch's statement, and that challenge came in the form of a deposition request that Holt navigated with the careful, experienced aggression of someone who knew exactly how much to give and what to hold back. She'd anticipated, though she'd said nothing to Beckett about anticipating it, that the Marlowe brothers would eventually make a decision about their position. They came to the ranch on a Tuesday 3 weeks before the hearing, both of them, which was notable, and they asked to speak with Beckett, and Marlowe sat at the far end of the table without being invited to and without apology, and the Marlowe brothers had clearly decided to accept this because neither of them objected. Gerald told Beckett that they had information about the water transport route that Crow had been using to move the diverted creek water to his east, operation-specific dates and quantities that the Marlowes had been contracted to handle before they'd understood the full nature of what they were transporting. Clarence had records, paper records, kept in the careful way of men whose business depended on being able to prove what they'd moved and when. They weren't offering this out of altruism, and Marlowe didn't pretend they were. They were offering it because the legal tide had shifted, and they were practical men who'd done the math. But the information was real, and the records were real, and Holt received them with a contained, professional satisfaction that was the closest thing to visible excitement she'd seen from him. What she hadn't anticipated was Decker. 3 days before the hearing, he came to the office again, the same doorframe knock, the same hat held in front of him, and he said, "I want to testify." She put her pen down at the hearing? Yes. He shifted his weight. I know things about this property and what's been happening to it for the past 2 years. I know the cattle loss pattern better than anyone. I've been looking at it wrong, thinking drought and predators, but looking at it now with what I know," he stopped. "I can speak to pattern, operational pattern over time. I don't know if that's useful." "It's useful," she said. "Let me talk to Holt." Holt received the offer with the same contained satisfaction as the Morrow records. He deposed Decker 2 days before the hearing, and Decker spoke with the particular clarity of a man who understood cattle and land and work in his bones, and who had, after a long time, decided what side of a line he was standing on. After Decker left the deposition session, he walked past Marlowe in the hall of Holt's county seat office, and he stopped, briefly, and said, "You were right about the documentation. From the beginning. You helped build it," she said. "Your operational records are in there." "Because you asked for them," he said. "In the second week, before I was willing to be helpful about it." He paused. "I wasn't fair to you. You already said that," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm saying it again because once wasn't enough." She looked at him. He was a straight-backed, difficult man with a fixed view of things that had been built over 6 years of hard range work, and he'd revised it because the evidence demanded it, and that was not nothing. That was, in fact, considerably more than most people managed. "We're square, Decker," she said. He nodded once, put his hat on, and went out into the county seat afternoon, and she watched him go and thought about what it had taken him to walk into that office and say what he'd said, and she thought it had taken more than he'd made it look like. The hearing itself lasted 2 days, which was not how she'd imagined it, and was exactly how Holt had told her it would go slower than you think, and faster than you're ready for, with long stretches of procedural patience, punctuated by moments that felt like the room had changed temperature. Crow was present both days, seated at the opposing table with his lawyer and 2 associates, and he was composed in the way of someone who had decided that composure was his best available position. He looked at Beckett across the room on the first morning, with the expression of a man who believes the situation is still recoverable. By the second afternoon, that expression had changed. Marlowe was not a named party to the proceedings. She sat in the gallery, which was the correct place for her. She watched and she listened, and she held the backup folder of documents she'd prepared in case anything was needed, which was her way of being useful in a situation where being useful was not her designated role. When Holt presented the Morrow records, Crow's lawyer objected on 3 grounds, none of which the judge sustained. When Decker testified about operational pattern and cattle loss, Crow's lawyer cross-examined at length, and Decker answered every question with the flat, certain authority of a man who has spent 6 years knowing exactly what he's talking about, and the cross-examination produced nothing that hadn't already been in the testimony. When the photographs of the boot prints were entered into evidence, Crow's lawyer said they were inconclusive. The judge looked at them for a long time and said nothing, which told Marlowe something. The judgment came on the second afternoon. It was not everything. It was never everything, because nothing produced by a legal proceeding is everything, and she'd known that from the beginning, but it was enough. Crow was found to have engaged in coordinated interference with the Callahan property's water rights. Cattle removal was characterized as organized theft attributable to his operation. The fraudulent payments through Finch were confirmed as financially criminal. The arson finding was pending a separate criminal investigation, but the judge made clear from the bench that the evidentiary record on that point was, in his assessment, compelling. Crow would pay restitution. He would face restrictions on his land operations for a period the attorneys would negotiate. The criminal investigation would proceed. He would not be acquiring the Callahan property. Marlowe sat in the gallery and she heard the judgment, and she felt the moment pass through her without the wave of relief she'd expected. It was more like the quiet that follows a long sustained effort, when the effort is finally definitively over a stillness that takes a moment to recognize because you've been moving for so long that stillness feels like something's wrong. Nothing was wrong. They had won. Not completely. Not cleanly. Not without cost. The barn was still being rebuilt. The operation was still recovering. The accounts were still strained. But they had won the thing that mattered. She looked across the room at Beckett, who was standing as the gallery began to move around them, and he looked back at her, and what was in his face was not triumph or relief either. It was something quieter than both of those. Something that had been building for long enough that it no longer needed an occasion to make itself visible. She held the backup folder against her chest, and she let herself breathe. Outside on the county seat steps, with the afternoon long and warm around them, Holt shook their hands and made his professional farewells and left them standing there with the judgment behind them and the ranch ahead. Beckett stood beside her, and they were both quiet. And after a while he said, in the same voice he used for things that mattered and that he'd chosen carefully, "You did this." "We did this," she said. "That's generous. That's accurate," she said. You gave me access to the books on the first day. You listened. You rode out with me to the berm. You staked the south pasture and held back from Crow when everything in you wanted to ride. She looked at him. I had the documentation. You made it possible to build it. He looked at her steadily. The afternoon light was at a low angle and it was warm, and she was aware of him in the particular way she'd been aware of him for weeks. Not abstractly, not as the man in the letter who'd required a wife of practical disposition, but as this specific person standing beside her, difficult and guarded, and more than she'd thought he was on that first long ride out from Red Creek. I need to ask you something, he said. She waited. I said before, when we first arrived, that if you wanted to leave, I'd make sure you had enough to build a new life. He looked out at the street, which was what he did when he was saying something that cost him something. I meant that. I mean it now, too. What just happened, what you did, you don't owe me anything after this. You could go anywhere you wanted, and you'd have the resources for it. She understood what he was doing. She understood it was genuine, and that it was not easy for him to say, and she stood with it for a moment, before she answered because she thought it deserved that. I know, she said, I know I could. He looked back at her. He was waiting, the way she usually waited, quietly and without pressure. I don't want to go anywhere, she said. I want to go back to the ranch and finish the barn rebuild and fix the drainage problem in the east pasture that I've been looking at for 3 weeks and renegotiate the Grannis feed contract before the autumn pricing changes. She paused. That's what I want. He was quiet for a long moment. Something moved through his face that was slow and certain, and that she recognized at last for exactly what it was. All right, he said. All right, she said. They walked down the steps together and went to find Garrett, who had the horses, and the afternoon light lay long and flat across the county seat street, and the ranch was 2 hours' ride south, and it was waiting for them, imperfect and costly and genuinely solidly theirs. The ride back from the county seat took 2 hours and 20 minutes because Garrett's horse threw a shoe outside of Miller's Creek, and they had to stop at the farrier there, which was an inconvenience that felt, in the context of the day, almost funny. Marlowe stood outside the farrier's small operation and watched the clouds moving west, and she thought, this is how things actually end. Not with ceremony. With a thrown shoe and a 20-minute wait in a town you've never been to, and then you get back on and keep riding. She said none of that out loud. Garrett was telling the farrier something about the storm damage to the east barn, and the farrier was listening with the attentive sympathy of a man who knew Beckett Callahan by reputation and was forming an opinion about the situation in real time. Beckett stood at the water trough with his horse and his shoulder, which was healing but not healed, and he had the look of a man who had finished a very long thing and had not yet started adjusting to the silence where that thing used to be. She understood that feeling. She'd had it before, when her father's property dispute finally resolved, and she'd spent 3 days afterward not knowing what to do with her hands. You didn't fix that feeling by talking about it. You fixed it by finding the next problem and beginning. She already knew what the next problem was. The east pasture drainage had been sitting in the back of her mind for 3 weeks, a slow-moving issue that the legal situation had repeatedly pushed below the immediate horizon. There was a section of ground near the lower fence that retained water badly after heavy rain. Not a crisis in dry season, but a potential significant problem when autumn came and the rains started in earnest. That section flooded and the fence post shifted. They'd be looking at a repair job under wet conditions that would cost twice what it would cost to address it now. She'd priced the drainage solution already. She had the figures in the ledger at home. Home. She noticed she'd thought the word without deciding to, and she let it sit there and looked at the clouds moving west, and didn't examine it too hard. They reached the ranch as the last light was going. Beulah had held supper, which she did without being asked, and when they came through the door, she looked at their faces and read whatever was in them and said, without preamble, it's on the stove. She didn't ask how the hearing had gone. She didn't need to. That was Marlowe had come to understand, how Beulah operated. She gathered information through observation rather than inquiry, and she acted on it without commentary. And what had initially felt like indifference was actually a form of respect that Marlowe had taken too long to recognize. She'd been measuring Beulah against a warmer standard, and Beulah wasn't interested in meeting that standard. She was interested in running her kitchen well and knowing what was happening on her ranch, and she did both thoroughly. Her ranch, Marlowe noticed that too. They ate, the three of them, Beckett, Marlowe, Garrett, who was invited in by Beckett with a nod that Garrett accepted without ceremony. Beulah ate in the cookhouse as she usually did. The supper was plain and hot, and the kitchen was quiet except for the sounds of eating and the distant settling of the house. And nobody felt the need to summarize the day out loud because they'd all been there. Afterward, Garrett went to the bunkhouse. Beckett cleared the plates, which he had started doing sometime in the past 3 weeks. Not every night, but often enough that it had become part of the texture of evenings. And Marlowe sat at the table with the east pasture drainage notes she'd gone to retrieve from the office, because the next problem was the next problem. Beckett came back from the wash basin and looked at the papers on the table and said, "Tonight? I'm just reviewing," she said. "I'm not asking you to do anything tonight." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "What is it?" She showed him the drainage notes, the section of pasture, the retention problem, the cost of addressing it before autumn. He looked at the figures with the attention he brought to anything that had numbers in it, which was more genuine than she had expected from a man who had always run his operation, largely on instinct and accumulated knowledge. "You've been sitting on this for 3 weeks," he said. "Other things were more urgent," she said. "And now?" "Now it's the most urgent thing," she said. "After the barn, which is ongoing." He looked at the estimate. "This is less than I'd have guessed. Because I sourced the drainage material through Grannis rather than the local supplier," she said. "The local markup on that grade of tile is unreasonable." He looked at her. The kitchen lamp was between them and above them, and it cast the kind of light that made things look very much like themselves without flattery. He said, "I want to ask you something." She waited. "The accounts," he said. "The water contracts, the supply sourcing, the feed rotation, all of it. I want to formalize that. I want it to be yours officially, not just something you've been doing because there was nobody else to do it." She was quiet for a moment. "You mean as a role? I mean as a fact," he said. "It already is the fact. I want the paperwork to match it." She looked at the drainage notes and then back at him. "There are people in town who would have opinions about that," she said. "Men who've done business with you for years, who will need to adjust to dealing with me instead. Some of them already have," he said. "Grannis wrote to me directly last month to say he found you easier to negotiate with than I am. Which isn't hard, but he didn't say it as an insult." She almost smiled. "Grannis has good instincts, yes," Beckett said. "And bad penmanship, but that's a separate issue." He paused. "I'm not asking because it's convenient. I'm asking because it's right. What happened with Crow, what you built, what you held together, that wasn't a wife managing the household. That was a partner managing a crisis." He looked directly at her. "I've been running this place alone for a long time, and I've been doing it by knowing what I know and ignoring what I don't. That almost cost me everything." "You didn't ignore it," she said. "Once you knew, you listened." "Because you made it impossible not to," he said. "I'm aware of the distinction," he paused. "I'm not good at..." He stopped. "Try it again." "I've been told before that I'm hard to be around, that I run too much on my own judgment and I don't make room for." "You make room," she said. "You made room for me. It wasn't fast and it wasn't easy, but you did it." He looked at her across the lamp. "It got easier," he said. "That's the thing. Once I started, it got considerably easier than I expected." She knew what he meant. She knew, because the same had been true for her, that the specific difficulty of those first weeks, the careful management of distance and position, and how much to offer and how much to hold back, had gradually become something else. Not easy exactly, but natural. The difference between swimming against a current and swimming with it, where the effort is the same, but the result is entirely different. She said, "I'm staying, Beckett. I told you that on the county seat steps, and it was true then, and it's true now. You don't need to formalize anything to make that more certain." "I know," he said. "I'm not formalizing it to hold you here. I'm formalizing it because you've earned it." The word sat between them, and she let it sit. Earned was not a word she'd expected to matter to her as much as it did, but it had always been the word she'd wanted, not given, not granted, not accommodated. Earned. The thing you arrive at through the specific difficult work of demonstrating your value in conditions where demonstration is the only currency accepted. "All right," she said. He nodded. Not dramatically. Just the nod of a man confirming a decision that felt, to both of them, less like a new thing and more like acknowledging something that had already been true for a while. Turned back to the drainage notes. He reached across and pulled the estimate toward him to look at it more carefully. They sat there in the lamplight, working through it, the way they'd worked through a dozen things before, and outside the ranch was dark and quiet, and the barn rebuild was half finished against the east wall, and in 6 weeks the autumn rains would come. The barn was finished on a Thursday, in late August, 17 days ahead of the estimate. Marlowe had built in the first devastated morning after the fire. It came in ahead not because anything went exceptionally right, but because Decker ran the rebuild with the focused, experienced efficiency of a man who had something to prove not to Marlowe, not even to Beckett, but to himself, which is the kind of motivation that produces the best results. She walked through it with him the morning after completion, which she'd asked to do and which he'd accepted without objection. The structure was sound. She could see that, and the new roof was better than the old one had been, properly ventilated and set at an angle that would handle heavy rainfall better than the configuration that had preceded it. Decker had made that adjustment on his own initiative without being asked, because he knew the land and he knew what autumn did to structures that weren't prepared for it. You changed the roof pitch, she said. Old one pooled water in the northwest corner, he said. Would have been a problem by November, I know, she said. I noticed it in the original survey, but I wasn't sure how to raise it without... She stopped. It was on my list. He looked at her sideways. I beat you to it. Yes, she said, you did. They stood there for a moment in the good smell of new timber and fresh-laid straw, and it was not a warm moment between them. It was never exactly warm between them, and she suspected it wouldn't be. That they were two people with enough friction in their natures that warmth was never going to be the texture of it. But it was real. It was the thing you get when two people have been honest with each other under difficult circumstances, and honesty, she'd found, produced something more durable than warmth, even if it produced it more slowly. Good work, she said. All of it. Good materials list, he said. And that was as much as it was ever going to be, which was fine. The restitution payment from Crow arrived in September, processed through the territorial court and delivered by the sheriff's office in a formal exchange that Holt attended and that Marlowe documented in the accounts with the same careful notation she applied to everything else. The amount was what the judgment specified, which was less than the full cost of the damage and more than she'd allowed herself to count on, which was the position she always tried to occupy with money, expecting less, planning for what you get. She used the first portion to settle the remaining material debts from the barn rebuild. The second portion went into the reserve account she'd established in the summer, the one Beckett had initially questioned and then approved when she explained what it was, for a buffer, specifically sized to carry the operation through a worst-case drought extension, without requiring emergency selling. The third portion she put toward the east pasture drainage, which had been completed in early September just ahead of the first autumn rain, and which had performed exactly as she'd calculated, diverting water efficiently and keeping the lower fence posts firm in ground that would otherwise have gone soft. When the first autumn rain came and the pasture drained properly and the fence held, she stood at the window of the main house and looked at it and felt the particular quiet satisfaction of a calculation that came in right. Not triumph, not relief. Just yes, that's what should happen. And it happened. Beckett came to stand beside her at the window. He'd been doing that more, coming to stand where she was, occupying the same viewpoint, as though he'd decided that what she was looking at was worth looking at, too. Fence is holding, he said. Yes, she said. You said it would. I said it should, she said. There's a difference. Looked her sideways. Not much of one. Enough of one, she said. I don't promise outcomes. I build conditions for them. He was quiet for a moment. That's a careful way to live. It's an accurate way to live, she said. Outcomes depend on things you can't always control. Conditions you can. He thought about that in the particular way. He thought about things she said that he found worth thinking about thoroughly, and without rush, and without the need to produce a conclusion on schedule. It was one of the things about him that she'd come to genuinely value, that quality of considered attention, because it was rare and it was real. Holt wrote, he said, the criminal investigation on the arson is moving forward. He thinks there's enough for a formal charge. Against Crow specifically? Against two of his men directly. Crow as directing party, he paused. Holt says it's not certain. He doesn't want to overstate it. Holt never overstates anything, she said. It's his best quality, and his most frustrating one. Yes, she said, both. Outside, the rain was coming down in the steady, moderate way of autumn in that territory, not the violence of the summer storm, just rain doing what rain does, which is fall and collect and find the low places and pool there. The creek to the east was running at full level for the first time since she'd arrived, and in the gray rain it looked like it had always meant to be that wide, that present. She watched it and she thought about what she'd thought the first day she'd seen it running low, standing in the ranch yard with her traveling bag, knowing nobody, knowing nothing except the numbers in a ledger she hadn't yet been given access to. She'd thought, this is wrong. She'd thought it before she had any investment in the place being right, before she'd earned anything, before she'd known anyone, before any of it. That was the thing she supposed about the way she was built. She saw what was there, not what was supposed to be there. She always had. It had not always been useful. It had made her difficult in Hester County, where people had preferred their version of the picture to the accurate one, and it had made her the kind of woman her family had thought needed an arranged solution rather than an opportunity. But out here, in this particular place, with this particular set of broken and complicated things to deal with, it had been exactly and precisely what was needed. Not because the frontier rewarded a certain kind of woman. The frontier didn't reward anyone reliably. It just imposed conditions, and the conditions happened to be the kind she was equipped for. In October, Beckett Callahan did a thing that surprised her more than almost anything that had happened in the 4 months since the stage had rolled into Red Creek. He called together the ranch hands, all of them, Decker and Garrett and Pruitt and Cole, and the 2 new men they'd hired in September to handle the expanded operations, and he stood in the yard in the morning light and he told them, plainly and without ceremony, that going forward the financial operations, supply management, water rights, and strategic planning for the ranch were Marlowe's domain, and that questions and decisions in those areas went through her. Not that she would advise him, and he would decide. Those areas were hers. She was standing to his left, and she had not been told this was going to happen. He'd mentioned wanting to address the hands about the formal arrangement, and she'd agreed, but the specific phrasing was his, and she was hearing it at the same time they were. She watched Decker's face. He listened with the flat, attentive expression of a man who is registering information and filing it. When Beckett finished, Decker said, "Understood." In the same tone he said everything direct, minimal, neither objecting nor endorsing, simply acknowledged. Cole looked at Marlowe with the open, slightly amazed expression of someone who had not entirely expected the world to be arranged this way, and was finding it more interesting than he'd anticipated. Garrett nodded. That was Garrett. Pruitt looked at the ground, which was what Pruitt did when he was thinking, and then he looked up and said, "The east pasture fence, the section near the canyon mouth, needs attention before winter. I can take Cole and do it this week if you want it on the schedule." He said it to Marlowe. She said, "Yes. Thursday works. Get your material estimate to me by Wednesday noon." "Yes, ma'am," he said. And that was the end of the meeting, and the hands went back to their work. She stood in the yard with Beckett and felt the autumn air on her face, and the weight of what had just happened settling around her in its actual practical dimensions. "You could have told me," she said. "I could have," he said. "I thought you might argue about the phrasing." "I might have," she admitted. "I didn't want to negotiate the phrasing," he said. "I wanted to say it correctly." She looked at him. "You said it correctly," she said. He looked back at her. The morning light was the thin, clean light of early October, without the heat that had defined everything since she'd arrived, and in it his face was very much itself, not softened by the light, not made easier, just clear. "There's something else," he said. She waited. He was not a man who struggled with words in general, but he struggled with certain kinds of words, the ones that required him to be visible in a way that his nature resisted. She'd watched him manage this struggle for 4 months, and she'd learned to leave space for it rather than fill it, which was a discipline for her, because her instinct was always to reach for the next thing. "I was wrong about what this was going to be," he said. "When I wrote that letter, when I made the arrangement," he paused. "I thought I needed a practical solution to a problem, someone who could manage a household and not make things more complicated than they already were." "I made things considerably more complicated," she said. "Yes," he said. "You made things considerably more true." He looked at the ranch yard, at the rebuilt barn, at the repaired fence in the distance, and the full running creek beyond it. "I've been out here a long time, and I've run this on my own judgment and my own terms, and I've been right often enough to keep going. But I'd stopped knowing what I didn't know. That's a dangerous place to be." He paused. "You knew what you didn't know, every step of it, and you worked with it instead of around it." She thought about the first week, when she'd been careful not to push too fast because she was new, and her credibility was fragile, and she was running numbers in her head to decide which risks were worth taking. She'd known precisely how much she didn't know, and she'd moved accordingly, not because she was humble by nature. She was not especially humble, but because she was precise, and precision demanded accounting for the gaps. "I knew what you needed," she said. "Once I understood what was happening to the ranch, it was clear what was needed. That's not the same as knowing the land or the animals or the people the way you do." "No," he said, "it's a different kind of knowing. I told you that early on." "You did," she said. "I didn't fully believe it when I says it," he said. "I believe it now." She let that land and settle. There was a version of this moment that would have been easier, a cleaner, more obvious version with clearer signals and less accumulated weight behind it. And she was glad they'd arrived at this version instead, the one that was built on 4 months of difficult and imperfect and genuine experience. The kind you can't manufacture and can't shortcut. Kind that means something because of what it cost. "I'm not an easy person to be around," she said. It seemed fair to say. "I know," he said. "I'm not either." "We've managed," she said. "We have," he said, "better than I expected." "Better than I expected, too," she said, which was true, and which she would not have said to him 3 months ago, because 3 months ago she hadn't been certain enough of him to be that honest. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the morning continued around them in its ordinary way, unhurried by any of it. "I'd like this to be a real marriage," he said, "if that's something you want." She was quiet for a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to say it right, not quickly, not reflexively, with the full weight of what she meant behind it. "It already is a real marriage," she said. "It's been real for a while. I think we've just been deciding whether to call it that." He was quiet, then he said, "I'm calling it that." "So am I," she said. He reached out and took her hand, which was a simple thing and was not simple at all. She let him hold it, and she stood there in the October morning on the ranch that had become, improbably and through considerable difficulty, hers as much as his. The year that followed was not easy. She would think about that later, in the specific way she thought about things she wanted to remember accurately. Not the version that got softened in retrospect, but the actual texture of it, which was hard in the ways that work is hard when you're doing it for real, with real stakes and real consequences. The accounts were a sustained pressure for the first 6 months. The drought had left a deficit in the cattle weights that took a full cycle to recover. The legal proceedings around the arson charge dragged into the following spring and required 2 more documented submissions from Marlowe and 1 additional deposition from Decker, who provided it without complaint and who had, in the intervening time, become something that was not exactly friendly but was functionally reliable, in a way that she'd decided was more valuable. Cole talked too much and was late with his estimates approximately half the time, and she told him this directly in October and again in December, and he improved somewhat, which she accepted as the realistic outcome. Beulah made a pie for the first time without being asked, at Christmas, and left it on the kitchen table without comment, and Marlowe ate a piece and said to Beckett, quietly, that it was very good. And Beckett said he'd tell Beulah, and Marlowe said she'd tell her herself, and she did. And Beulah received the compliment with the contained, unsentimental satisfaction of a woman who knows her work is good and doesn't require the knowing to be elaborate. In March, the territorial court issued the formal arson charge against Crow's 2 men. Crow himself was named as a directing party in the filing and faced a separate civil proceeding that Holt expected to result in additional financial penalties. His eastern operations, without the diverted water and without the financial channel through Finch and without the network of county relationships that had begun fracturing after the hearing, contracted significantly. The water transport contract went to the Morrow brothers, who ran it without drama and who sent Marlowe a letter in February thanking her for what she'd said to them the previous summer, which she found professionally gratifying and personally awkward because she hadn't done it for their gratitude and didn't quite know what to do with it. She wrote back and said she was glad the contract was working and that they should reach out if the water volumes needed renegotiating in the spring. Garrett asked for a raise in February, and she gave him most of what he asked for, which was the right amount because she'd been tracking his output for 6 months, and it was worth what he asked. She told him why she was approving the amount she was approving, because she found that people worked better when they understood the reasoning, and Garrett was the kind of man who'd think about the reasoning and take it seriously. Pruitt said nothing about any of it and continued to be useful in his quiet, reliable way. And one morning in April, she found he'd repaired the northwest corner of the main house porch without being asked because it had been creaking, and she left a note on the bunkhouse door that said simply, "Thank you." He never acknowledged the note, but the work continued to be impeccable. The creek ran full through the following summer. She stood at the bank one morning in July alone, in the early hour before the heat settled in, and she looked at the water running the way water is supposed to run, when nothing is diverting it steady and purposeful and indifferent. The way natural things are indifferent, without malice and without favor, just doing what the ground and the gravity and the rainfall make possible. She'd stood at this bank the first week she arrived and seen it running low and felt the wrongness of it. She stood here now and felt the rightness of it, and the distance between those 2 moments contained everything that had happened, every ledger entry, every difficult conversation, every night at the kitchen table, every moment of choosing patience when the faster move was available, and might have felt better. She didn't think she'd become someone different. That was the thing she wanted to be clear about, at least to herself, in the private way that a person can be clear about something without needing to announce it. She was the same woman who'd stood in the dirt street of Red Creek with her traveling bag and watched people on the boardwalk decide who she was. She was the woman who'd counted fence posts on that first long ride and run numbers in her head, because numbers had always been where she found solid ground. She was large and quiet and imperfect and capable of misjudging people. She'd misjudged Beulah. She'd been slower than she should have been to see Decker's potential as an ally. She'd moved too fast in one early conversation with Beckett and had to repair it. None of that had changed. What had changed was the world around her, which had adjusted slowly, imperfectly, at significant cost, to match what she actually was rather than what it had assumed. That was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the thing. Because the hardest problem she'd faced since arriving in Red Creek had never been Crow or the drought or the fire or the legal proceedings. The hardest problem had been the simpler, older one, being somewhere that had already decided what she was before she opened her mouth. Crow had tried to take the land. the land she could fight for with documentation and patience and a very good attorney. But the other thing, the thing in people's faces on the boardwalk, in Decker's early silences, in the magistrate's careful neutrality, you couldn't file that with a court. You could only outlast it, which was exhausting and slow and was the only method that worked. She had outlasted it. She stood at the creek and felt the morning air on her face, and she thought about all the women she'd known in Hester County who had been where she'd been capable and overlooked and solving problems that nobody was going to credit them for, because the credit would have required an acknowledgement that the problem-solving was happening at all. Most of them had not had a burning barn to make their usefulness undeniable. Most of them had not had the specific fortune of arriving somewhere that was broken in exactly the ways they knew how to fix. Most of them were still in Hester County doing the work and not getting the Adele at the land office, telling them that people's views were changing. That was luck as much as anything else. She was clear-eyed enough to know that. The competence was hers. The particular conditions that allowed the competence to matter. The ledger she was given access to on the first day, the man who listened when she spoke even when he didn't want to, the ranch that was failing in documented and fixable ways. Those were not something she'd produced. She'd walked into them. What she'd done with them was hers. She turned from the creek and walked back toward the house, and the morning was very clear and the ranch was waking around her. Sounds she knew now the way you know the sounds of a place that belongs to you. The specific door of the cookhouse, the way Garrett's boots sounded on the packed dirt going to the corral, the distant early movement of the cattle in the east pasture. Beckett was on the porch with 2 cups of coffee, which had become the texture of mornings. He handed her one when she reached the steps, and she took it and stood beside him, and they looked at the ranch in the morning light, imperfect and costly and genuinely working, the way things are working when the work is real. "East fence crew goes out today," she said. "I know," he said. "Pruitt has the materials. I checked last night. I know that too," he said. He looked at her sideways. "I do occasionally know things without being told." "Occasionally," she said. He shook his head with the slight motion that was as close as he usually got to laughing, and she drank her coffee and looked at the ranch, and felt the weight of the day ahead of her, which was considerable and was hers, and felt underneath that weight the specific, solid thing that she'd never had a perfect word for, the feeling of being in the right place, doing the right work, with the right amount of difficulty to make it mean something. Not happiness exactly. Something more durable than that. The feeling of a life that fit. She stood on the porch with her coffee, and the October light and the man beside her, who was difficult and real, and hers in the way she was his, not by arrangement anymore, but by the slow, hard-won accumulation of everything that had happened since the stage rolled into Red Creek. And she'd stepped out into the dirt street and let people look. They had looked, and now they knew.